I spent 40 years breaking my back to give my son the life I never had. But when I refused to sign away my home to cover his $84,000 debt, he did the unthinkable. He shoved me out of his luxury car into the blistering heat of the Nevada desert. "You made your choice, Dad," he told me as he threw a half-empty plastic water bottle into the dirt. "Let us see how long your stubborn pride lasts out here." He drove away, leaving me to die. What he did not know was that the father he abandoned was not just a helpless old man. A week later, a county sheriff knocked on my door holding an envelope, and that was the exact moment my son realized he had dug his own grave. The air conditioning inside Derek's leased luxury sport utility vehicle was blasting so hard it made my joints ache. We were driving down a desolate, cracked stretch of Nevada highway, a solid 2 hours outside the city limits. The digital thermometer on the sleek dashboard glared a bright, glowing 113 degrees. Outside the tinted windows, the landscape was nothing but baked asphalt, shimmering heat waves, and jagged rocks that looked like they had been cooked in a kiln since the dawn of time. I sat in the passenger seat, my heavy, calloused hands resting on my knees, staring out at the unforgiving wasteland. My name is Hank Caldwell. I am 68 years old, and for 4 decades I worked as a heavy-duty diesel mechanic. I spent my entire life covered in grease and sweat repairing massive mining excavators and commercial hauling rigs. I worked double shifts in the freezing rain and the boiling sun so my family would never know the bitter, humiliating taste of poverty. My son Derek sat behind the leather steering wheel. He was 36 years old, wearing a tailored linen shirt and a silver watch that cost more than my first pickup truck. In the back seat was his wife, Chloe. She had not spoken a single word to me since I climbed into the vehicle. She was too busy scrolling on her expensive smartphone, her designer sunglasses pushed up into her highlighted hair, tapping her manicured nails impatiently against the leather door trim. They had told me we were driving out here to look at a prime piece of commercial real estate. Derek said he was finally making big moves at his investment firm and wanted his old man's practical advice on a parcel of land before he closed the deal. I should have known better. I should have recognized the suffocating heavy tension filling the cabin of the car. Derek's knuckles were stark white as he gripped the steering wheel. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see a muscle twitching wildly near his ear. There was no real estate investment. There was only a trap, and I was riding right into the steel jaws of it. Without any warning, Derek slammed his foot on the brake pedal. The heavy vehicle violently swerved onto the dirt shoulder, the anti-lock brakes grinding loudly against the loose gravel. A massive cloud of white dust kicked up briefly, blocking out the blinding sun. My seatbelt locked hard against my chest, knocking the wind straight out of my lungs. "What in the world are you doing, Derek?" I asked, trying to catch my breath and steady my racing heart. "Did an animal run out into the road?" Derek threw the transmission into park with a violent, jerky motion. He did not look at me. He just stared straight ahead through the windshield at the barren, baking wasteland. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, broken only by the aggressive hum of the cold air conditioning. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She let out a sharp, arrogant sigh. "Just do it, Derek," she snapped from the back seat. "We do not have all day to sit out here in the middle of absolute nowhere. My skin is already drying out." Derek finally turned his head to face me. The expression I saw in his eyes made the blood in my veins run entirely cold. It was not the face of the boy I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle. It was not the face of the young man I had proudly watched walk across his college graduation stage. It was the face of a desperate, cornered predator. He reached into the deep center console and pulled out a thick manila folder. He slapped it down hard onto my lap. "Sign it, Dad," he said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth, affection, or respect. I looked down at the folder. My rough fingers slowly opened the heavy paper cover. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents. The bold black letters at the very top of the first page read, irrevocable power of attorney. Underneath that was a quitclaim deed transferring the full unencumbered ownership of my house directly into Derek's name. It was the house my late wife, Martha, and I had spent 30 years meticulously paying off. The house where we had celebrated every single holiday, where we had weathered every financial storm, and where she had taken her final breath. "What is this, Derek?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly low and measured even though my heart was pounding furiously against my ribs. "What are you asking me to do right now?" "I am not asking you, Dad. I am telling you," he spat, his face flushing with a sudden ugly surge of anger. "I am in a hole, a massive unfixable hole. I owe $84,000 and the people I owe it to do not care about excuses. They want their money by Monday morning. If I do not wire those funds, I am going to lose everything. I will lose my corporate job, I will lose this car, and Chloe and I will be utterly ruined." I stared at him in sheer paralyzing disbelief. $84,000. "How do you rack up $84,000 in debt?" I demanded, my voice rising with righteous indignation. "You make a six-figure salary. You live in a gated community. You take vacations to resorts I could never afford. Where did the money go?" From the back seat, Chloe let out a defensive, theatrical scoff. "That is none of your business, Hank," she said, her voice dripping with sheer condescension and disrespect. "Derek is a financial consultant. Sometimes investments take a downturn. The market shifted. It is a temporary liquidity issue, and you are going to help us fix it, because that is what family does." I turned slightly to look at her, my vision narrowing. A temporary liquidity issue. I repeated the corporate buzzwords, slowly tasting the bitter, spoiled entitlement in them. "You want me to sign away the only home I have left in this world, the home I bled for to cover your reckless lifestyle. You want me to hand over the roof over my head so you can keep driving leased luxury cars and buying imported designer handbags." Derek slammed his hand violently against the steering wheel, making the horn honk a short, aggressive blast. "Do not talk to my wife like that," he yelled, his eyes bulging. "You are sitting on a house worth $500,000 that is completely paid off. You live there all by yourself like a hermit. It is completely selfish for you to hoard that equity while your own son is drowning in debt. All I need is the deed. I can secure a fast commercial loan against the house, pay off the $84,000, and I will pay the mortgage every month. You will not even notice a difference." My mind worked with the rapid mechanical precision of a man who had spent a lifetime diagnosing catastrophic engine failures under extreme pressure. I looked at the boy I had sacrificed my absolute youth to protect. I remembered the endless overtime shifts I worked in the freezing sleet, just to afford his expensive university tuition, so he would never have to ruin his knees and his back like his father did. I remembered how my beautiful Martha would skip buying new clothes for herself for years just so Derek could have the best sports gear. And this was the ultimate return on our lifetime of investment. A son who viewed his father not as a human being, but as a disposable bank account waiting to be raided. "If you take a commercial loan against my house and default on the payments, the bank will foreclose and throw me out on the street," I stated, speaking the absolute, unvarnished truth of his predatory scheme. "You are asking me to gamble my daily survival on your consistently failed judgment. The answer is no. I will not sign these papers. I will not enable your financial suicide." I pushed the manila folder off my lap, letting it fall onto the center console with a dismissive thud. Derek's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He unbuckled his seatbelt with a violent, sharp click. He reached across the console, grabbed the front of my shirt with both of his soft, manicured hands, and shoved me hard against the passenger door window. "You are going to sign it!" he screamed, actual spit flying from his lips and hitting my cheek. "You owe me this. You brought me into this world, and it is your job to fix my problems." I did not raise my hands to strike him. I did not struggle. I simply looked into his furious, bloodshot eyes with a chilling, dead calm. "You ceased being a man the moment you blamed me for your own weakness. I whispered, my voice cutting through his hysteria. "I am not signing anything." Derek breathed heavily, his chest heaving, as the reality of my absolute refusal finally penetrated his thick, narcissistic skull. He realized I could not be bullied. I could not be intimidated by loud noises, physical posturing, or emotional blackmail. The flight or fight response triggered violently inside his brain, and he chose the absolute most cowardly option available to him. He reached over and hit the electronic lock button on my door. Then he forcefully grabbed the silver handle, pushed the heavy door open, and shoved me backward out of the vehicle with all his remaining strength. I tumbled backwards out of the elevated sport utility vehicle, my heavy work boots hitting the cracked, burning asphalt. I stumbled, fighting to keep my balance, but the momentum was too much. I fell hard onto the dirt shoulder, scraping my palms against the jagged, sharp rocks. The sheer impact knocked the breath completely from my lungs, but the sudden physical pain was instantly eclipsed by the overwhelming, suffocating heat of the desert. The 113-degree air hit my face like a solid wall of fire. The ground beneath my hands felt like the surface of a lit cast-iron stove. I pushed myself up onto my knees, my breath coming in ragged, dry, burning gasps. I looked up at the luxury vehicle. Derek was staring down at me from the comfortable air-conditioned driver's seat. He reached into the center cup holder, grabbed a crushed plastic water bottle that was less than half full, and hurled it out the open door. It landed in the white dust a few feet away from my knees. "You made your choice, Dad." Derek sneered, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy or remorse. "You love that house so much, let us see if it can save you out here. If you are that incredibly stubborn, you can find your own way home. Let us see how long your arrogant pride lasts when you are begging the sky for a drop of water." He slammed the passenger door shut with a loud metallic bang. Through the dark tinted window, I could see Chloe adjusting the air conditioning vent so the freezing air would blow directly onto her face. She did not even glance in my direction. She did not care that a 68-year-old man was being left to die. The powerful engine roared to life. The heavy tires spun violently against the loose gravel, kicking up a blinding shower of sharp rocks and a choking cloud of white dust that washed over my face and chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, shielding myself with my forearm, coughing as the dry dust coated my throat. By the time the dust finally settled back to the earth, the vehicle was already a quarter-mile down the highway, accelerating rapidly. I stayed on my knees in the scorching dirt, watching the red taillights warp and distort in the shimmering heat waves until they completely disappeared over the flat, baked horizon. The silence of the Mojave Desert was absolute, vast, and utterly deafening. There was no shade. There were no other cars in sight. There was nothing but endless miles of baked rock, a hostile, blinding sun, and the devastating realization that my only child had just handed me a brutal death sentence over a pile of debt. I slowly stood up, my knees popping in protest against the strain. The brutal heat was already beginning to draw the moisture directly through my skin. A normal man, a soft suburban retiree who had spent his entire life sitting comfortably behind a desk, would have panicked. He would have run aimlessly down the center of the asphalt, screaming for help, until the inevitable heat stroke boiled his brain and dropped him dead in the sand. But I was not a normal man, and my son had made a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. He thought he was abandoning a frail, helpless elder whose mind was slipping. He completely forgot that the man he left behind was a hardened veteran diesel mechanic who had spent 40 years surviving and working in the most brutal, unforgiving environments on Earth. I picked up the warm, half-empty plastic bottle from the dirt, dusted the rocks off my jeans, and looked out across the shimmering horizon. My son wanted to play a deadly game of survival. Now it was my turn to show him exactly what happens when you cross a man who has absolutely nothing left to lose. The taillights of my son's least luxury sport utility vehicle melted into the rippling heat waves, until there was absolutely nothing left but the blinding white glare of the Nevada desert. I stood completely alone on the cracked dirt shoulder. The silence was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. A normal suburban retiree would have panicked. A man who spent his life sitting in an air-conditioned office might have dropped to his knees, wept into the dust, or started running frantically down the center of the asphalt highway, waving his arms at passing cars, until his heart simply gave out. But my son made a massive fatal miscalculation when he decided to use the desert as his weapon. He forgot who I was. He looked at my gray hair and my 68-year-old frame and saw a helpless, senile old victim. He completely forgot that for 40 years I did not work in a comfortable office. I was a heavy-duty diesel mechanic. I spent decades covered in black grease turning wrenches on massive 3-story tall mining excavators right here in this exact unforgiving terrain. I knew the Mojave. I knew how it breathed, how it burned, and exactly how it killed. I did not panic. Panic is a useless emotion that only spikes your heart rate and drains your body of precious hydration. I looked down at the plastic water bottle Derek had thrown into the dirt like a scrap of garbage. I picked it up. It was barely half full, already warming rapidly in the 113-degree sun. I did not chug it. I took one tiny measured sip, just enough to coat my dry throat, and screwed the cap back on tightly. Right now, my body was no different than the overheated diesel engines I used to resurrect from the dead. I had a limited supply of coolant, an extreme external thermal load, and a strict mileage limit before my internal systems would suffer catastrophic failure. I had to operate on pure, cold mechanical logic. I looked at the paved highway. The black asphalt was a shimmering death trap. Walking along the shoulder meant exposing myself to the radiant heat bouncing off the road surface, which can easily reach 150 degrees. Furthermore, cars on this stretch of highway travel at 85 miles an hour. They do not stop for dusty, solitary old men walking in the dirt. They just assume you are a drifter or a hallucination. If I stayed on the highway, I would be dead by mid-afternoon. Instead, I turned my back to the road and faced the rugged, jagged ridges of the open desert. Back in the late 1990s, I spent 5 years running maintenance for a massive commercial gypsum mining operation just a few miles east of this exact location. I knew the geography. I knew that just over the second ridge, entirely hidden from the main public highway, was an old graded gravel utility road. The mining transport trucks still used it to bypass the state way stations and shave time off their haul routes. It was roughly a 2-mile hike over rough baked stone and dry brush. It was a brutal physical toll for a man my age, but it was my only mathematically viable route to survival. I pulled my cotton shirt up over the back of my neck to shield my skin from the direct radiation of the sun, checked my heavy work boots, and began to walk. I set a slow, methodical, deliberate pace. I did not rush. I placed one foot in front of the other, listening to the crunch of the dry earth beneath my soles. The heat was physically oppressive. It felt like walking through an invisible, suffocating wall of fire. The dry air sucked the moisture directly out of my eyes and lungs with every breath I took. As I navigated through the jagged rocks and the brittle creosote bushes, my mind began to work in perfect synchronization with my footsteps. With every step, I stripped away a layer of the fatherly compassion I had carried for 36 years. I thought about the $84,000 my son had demanded. I thought about the sheer arrogant entitlement dripping from my daughter-in-law's voice. They actually believed that by throwing me out into this wasteland, I would be broken. They thought the heat would melt my resolve that I would eventually stumble back to civilization, broken and terrified, begging for their mercy, and willing to sign away my home just for a glass of ice water. They were wrong. Every drop of sweat that stung my eyes, every sharp ache, radiating through my aging knees, only forged my anger into something harder and sharper than steel. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent under the bellies of massive dump trucks, inhaling diesel fumes and bleeding from scraped knuckles just so Derek could have a pristine, privileged life. I had shielded him from the grinding, bone-crushing reality of physical labor. I had handed him a life of comfort on a silver platter, and his gratitude was to casually discard me in a lethal environment the second I refused to finance his reckless mistakes. My legs began to burn, my chest to heave as I climbed the first steep, rocky incline. My vision swam for a brief moment, the edges of the desert blurring into a bright, blinding white glare. I stopped under the meager skeletal shade of a dead Joshua tree. I allowed myself a second, highly regulated sip of the warm water from the plastic bottle. I held the liquid in my mouth, letting my gums absorb the moisture before swallowing. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on regulating my heartbeat, forcing my breathing to slow down. I could not afford to pass out. I could not let my core temperature breach the critical zone. I pushed myself back off the trunk of the dead tree and kept moving. The second ridge was a grueling, agonizing climb. My thigh muscles screamed in protest. The heat radiating from the ground was baking the soles of my feet right through my thick leather boots. But I did not stop. I fueled my endurance with the absolute freezing certainty of what I was going to do when I got back to the city. I was not just going to survive this betrayal. I was going to meticulously, legally, and permanently dismantle my son's entire world. After nearly an hour and a half of relentless, agonizing walking, I finally crested the top of the second ridge. My lungs were burning and my lips were cracked and bleeding, but I looked down into the valley below and saw exactly what I knew would be there. A wide, flat strip of gray gravel cutting directly through the red desert rock. The utility access road. I carefully made my way down the steep slope, my boots slipping and sliding on the loose shale. When I finally reached the edge of the gravel road, my physical strength was dangerously close to its absolute limit. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, a clear symptom of severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. I sat down heavily on a large, flat boulder, right on the edge of the dirt path. I unscrewed the cap of the plastic bottle and drank the very last drop of the hot, plastic-tasting water. The bottle was completely empty. I dropped it into the dirt beside my boots. I had played my final card. Now I just had to trust my memory and the mechanical schedule of the local mining outfits. I sat there in the blinding sun, waiting. The heat beat down on my shoulders like a heavy lead blanket. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I closed my eyes, feeling a dangerous, heavy lethargy creeping into my brain. The temptation to just lie back against the warm rock and go to sleep was overwhelmingly powerful. Then I felt it before I actually heard it, a deep, rhythmic vibration trembling through the gravel beneath my boots. I opened my eyes and looked down the long, dusty stretch of the utility road. A massive, towering cloud of brown dust was billowing up into the clear blue sky. A moment later, the distinct, thunderous roar of a heavy-duty twin-turbo diesel engine echoed across the canyon. It was an 18-wheel industrial ore hauler, its massive chrome grille glinting fiercely in the afternoon sun. I forced myself to stand up. My legs wobbled dangerously, but I locked my knees and stepped right up to the edge of the gravel shoulder. I took off my shirt and waved it above my head, a bright, frantic flag of distress against the desolate landscape. The driver saw me. The massive truck let out a deafening, piercing blast from its air horn. The driver slammed on the brakes. I heard the sharp, violent hiss of the air brakes engaging as the heavy rig skidded slightly on the loose gravel, kicking up a blinding wall of dust and dirt. The massive machine came to a shuddering halt just 20 feet away from where I stood. The heavy passenger side door swung open, and a burly, weathered man with a thick gray beard and a faded Union cap leaned out from the high cab. He squinted down at me through the settling dust. Hank the man shouted, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated disbelief. "Hank Caldwell, is that you down there?" I looked up, shielding my eyes from the glare. It was Carl. He was an old union brother I had worked alongside for over 15 years. We had turned wrenches together, shared terrible coffee in freezing maintenance sheds, and fought side by side for fair wages back in the day. "What in the name of God are you doing out here?" Carl yelled over the rumbling idle of the massive engine. "You look like you just walked out of a furnace. Get yourself up here right now before you drop dead in the dirt." I grabbed the heavy metal grab handles and hauled my exhausted, aching body up the high metal steps into the cab of the truck. The moment I slammed the heavy door shut, the freezing, glorious blast of the industrial air conditioning washed over my skin. It was a physical shock to my system, pulling me back from the very brink of heat stroke. I collapsed into the wide, air-cushioned passenger seat, my entire body trembling as the adrenaline finally began to recede. Carl immediately reached into the small cooler sitting between the seats and pulled out a large frosted bottle of ice water. He shoved it into my hands without asking a single question. I unscrewed the cap and drank the freezing liquid. The cold water hit my empty stomach like a physical jolt of electricity, instantly reviving my failing internal systems. "Hank, seriously, man," Carl said, throwing the heavy truck back into gear and accelerating slowly down the gravel road. "Where is your vehicle? Did you break down? You are at least 2 hours away from any decent town. You could have baked to death out there." I took another long, slow drink of the ice water, letting the freezing temperature settle my racing heart. I stared straight ahead, through the large, bug-splattered windshield at the endless ribbon of dirt road stretching out before us. I did not look at Carl. I just kept my eyes fixed entirely on the horizon. "I did not break down, Carl," I said, my voice sounding incredibly raspy, yet remarkably steady and devoid of any lingering panic. "My son brought me out here. He demanded that I sign over the deed to my house to cover his gambling debts. When I told him no, he shoved me out of his luxury car, threw a half-empty water bottle at my chest, and drove away." Carl slammed his heavy work boot against the brake pedal in sheer shock, almost locking up the heavy trailer behind us. He stared at me, his jaw completely dropping, his weathered face twisting into a mask of pure horror and outrage. "Your own blood did that to you," Carl demanded, gripping the massive steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Your own son left you out here to die over money. Hank, we need to call the highway patrol right now. We need to call the state police and have that ungrateful boy thrown into a cell for attempted murder." I slowly shook my head. I leaned back into the comfortable passenger seat, feeling the cold air blast against my face. "No, Carl," I replied, my tone carrying the heavy, freezing weight of absolute finality. "We are not calling the local police. We are not filing a simple domestic dispute report." I looked down at my rough, grease-stained hands. The hands that had sacrificed everything for a boy who viewed me as nothing more than an expiring bank account. Sitting in the cold, humming cabin of that massive industrial rig, I made a silent, irrevocable vow. The kind, enabling, self-sacrificing father who had blindly funded Derek's entitlement was officially dead. The desert had burned that foolish man to absolute ash. "Take me back to the city, Carl," I said, my voice hardening into an instrument of pure, calculated retaliation. "My son firmly believes he has already won. He thinks he has eliminated a helpless old man. I am going to let him believe his plan worked perfectly right up until the exact moment I take absolutely everything he values and burn his entire world to the ground. Let us go home. I have a lot of work to do." Carl drove me across the state line under the cover of absolute darkness. I sat in the passenger seat of his massive industrial rig, watching the yellow highway lines blur together into an endless ribbon of survival. My body was completely battered from the brutal, blistering heat of the Mojave Desert, but my mind was operating with cold, terrifying clarity. I knew I could not go back to my own house in the suburbs. Derek would be watching the property. He would have his story perfectly rehearsed for the neighborhood watch and the local police. I needed a sanctuary. I needed a place where I could disappear completely from the grid while I gathered my strength. I asked Carl to drop me off at a lonely, illuminated truck stop just outside the county limits. From the rusted payphone inside the empty diner, I dialed a number I knew by heart. It belonged to Bill. Bill was my late wife, Martha's older brother. He was a fiercely loyal, hard-working man who lived up in the dense timberland mountains far away from city noise. When he answered the phone, I simply told him I was in trouble and needed him to pick me up immediately. He did not ask a single question. He arrived an hour later in his battered pickup truck. When I climbed into the cab and told him what his nephew had done to me in the desert, Bill gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He drove me deep into the dense woods far away from the paved roads and the cellular towers. We arrived at his remote hunting cabin just as the sun began to rise over the pine trees. The cabin was built from heavy, rough-hewn logs. It smelled of old wood smoke and quiet isolation. It was the exact place Martha and I used to spend our winters when Derek was just a little boy learning how to fish. Now it was my war room. For an entire week, I stayed hidden inside that cabin. Bill brought me fresh groceries, bottled water, and daily newspapers from the local town. My physical recovery was slow and agonizing. The desert heat had drained me entirely. For the first 3 days, my muscles cramped violently, and my skin burned with a deep radiating ache from the severe sun exposure. I spent hours sitting in an old rocking chair on the wooden porch, staring out at the towering pine trees. I used the absolute silence of the wilderness to process the monumental betrayal I had just survived. A father is supposed to protect his son. He is supposed to build a strong, unyielding foundation so his child can stand tall in this world. I had spent 40 years breathing heavy diesel fumes and breaking my back under massive machines to give Derek a perfect, privileged life. I had shielded him from every financial storm and every crushing disappointment, and his gratitude was an attempt to execute me in a scorching wasteland over an $84,000 debt. I realized with sickening clarity that the boy I raised was completely gone. He had mutated into a cold, calculating, and entitled predator. I did not shed a single tear during that week. Tears are a biological response to grief, and I was no longer grieving. I was meticulously engineering a counterstrike. Bill sat with me every evening by the cast-iron wood stove. He listened to my silence and understood the heavy, burdensome weight of my thoughts. We both knew that Derek would not simply stop at abandoning me. A predator always returns to consume the rest of the carcass. I needed to know what my son was doing back in the city. I needed to know what narrative he was selling to the world while he thought my bones were bleaching under the desert sun. On the morning of the 7th day, the heavy, peaceful silence of the woods was broken by the distinct, rhythmic crunch of heavy tires rolling over the gravel driveway. I was sitting on the porch drinking a cup of bitter black coffee. I did not run inside to hide. I simply placed my ceramic mug on the wooden railing and waited in the morning chill. Through the thick clearing of the pine trees, a white county patrol cruiser slowly pulled into the dirt yard. The heavy engine idled for a moment before turning off. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a man I had known for over 30 years. It was Sheriff Tom Miller. Tom was a seasoned veteran law enforcement officer with thick silver hair and a sharp, evaluating gaze. He was also an old and trusted family friend. He used to come to my house for summer barbecues when Martha was still alive. He and I had shared many cold beers on my back patio, discussing local politics and the endless struggles of raising stubborn boys. But today, Tom did not look like a friend dropping by for a casual visit. He looked incredibly grim, tired, and heavily burdened. In his large right hand, He held a thick brown envelope. He closed the car door and began walking toward the front steps of the cabin. He had been tipped off by a local forestry ranger who noticed thick smoke coming from Bill's chimney. The ranger knew the cabin was supposed to be completely empty this time of year and reported it to the sheriff. Tom came out here expecting to find teenage squatters or illegal poachers. He stopped dead in his tracks at the bottom of the wooden stairs. The large brown envelope slipped from Tom's fingers and landed softly in the dirt. His jaw literally dropped open. He stared up at me standing in the dark shadows of the porch as if he were looking at a physical resurrected ghost. The healthy color completely drained from his weathered face, leaving him pale and shaken. He took off his uniform hat and wiped a sudden heavy layer of sweat from his forehead. "Hank." He breathed out, his voice cracking with absolute sheer disbelief. "Hank Caldwell, is that actually you?" I walked down the creaking wooden steps and picked up the brown envelope from the dirt. I handed it back to him and looked him directly in the eyes. "It is me, Tom," I said quietly. "I am still breathing." Tom grabbed my shoulder, gripping my thick flannel shirt to ensure I was truly standing there in front of him. He looked wildly around the empty property and then back at my face. "Hank, the entire state of Nevada is looking for you," he said, his voice rising in professional panic. "We have specialized search and rescue teams combing the highway shoulders. We had thermal tracking helicopters in the air for 3 days straight. You have been officially presumed dead since yesterday morning." I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of surprise. "Why would they presume I am dead, Tom?" I asked, maintaining a dangerously calm and measured tone. "What exactly is the official story?" Tom took a deep, ragged breath and explained the elaborate theatrical lie my son had constructed. He told me that Derek had walked into the Central Police Station a week ago, sobbing uncontrollably. Derek had filed a highly publicized missing persons report. He told the local authorities that I was suffering from severe and rapid onset dementia. He claimed we were driving back from a real estate viewing when he stopped at a desolate highway rest area to use the restroom. According to my treacherous son, I became completely disoriented, opened the passenger door, and wandered aimlessly into the lethal heat of the desert wilderness. Tom explained that Derek even posted a tearful begging video on the internet asking the public for help to find his confused elderly father. The video went completely viral. Millions of people watched my son cry fake manipulative tears for the father he had intentionally pushed out of a moving vehicle. I listened to the entire disgusting narrative without interrupting him once. My son had not only tried to murder me, he had systematically assassinated my dignity. He painted me as a weak, senile old fool who could not even remember his own name or find his way out of a parking lot. He weaponized my age to cover up his monstrous greed. When Tom finished explaining, he looked at me with deep, profound confusion. "Hank, you do not have dementia," he stated, observing my sharp posture and steady gaze. "You are as lucid and alert as you have ever been. What in the world actually happened out there on that highway?" I gestured toward the wooden chairs on the porch. We walked up the steps, sat down, and I told Tom the absolute, unvarnished truth. I told him about the $84,000 corporate debt. I told him about the aggressive demand for my house deed. I described the exact moment Derek grabbed my shirt, shoved me onto the burning asphalt, threw a half-empty water bottle at my chest, and sped away, leaving me to bake in the 113-degree heat. Tom sat absolutely frozen in his wooden chair. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson as the brutal reality of the betrayal sank into his mind. He had watched Derek grow up, and the shock of this revelation visibly sickened him. He looked down at the brown envelope resting on his lap. He slowly opened the metal clasp and pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents. I was driving up here to check on the cabin, but I was also on my way to deliver these to your brother-in-law. Tom explained, his voice heavy with disgust. Since Bill is your closest living relative, besides Derek, the county court required us to serve him a copy of this notice. Tom handed the heavy stack of papers to me. I looked at the bold black letters printed at the very top of the page. It was a formal court notice for an emergency conservatorship. I read the legal document, carefully analyzing every single deceptive line. Derek was officially petitioning the county court to declare me mentally incompetent or legally deceased. He had hired a sleazy, aggressive lawyer to expedite the process based entirely on the fabricated dementia diagnosis and the failed desert search and rescue mission. The petition requested immediate and absolute control over my entire estate, my bank accounts, my medical directives, and my home. Derek was trying to legally erase my autonomy so he could seize my assets to pay off his massive hidden debts. He wanted the judge to hand him the keys to my kingdom on a silver platter. He was using the very crime he committed against me as the foundational evidence for his legal coup. Tom stood up from his chair, placing his hand firmly on his heavy service belt. "I am calling dispatch right now," Tom declared, his voice echoing across the porch with righteous fury. "I am sending a squad car to your house to arrest that boy for attempted murder and filing a false police report. He is going to spend the rest of his miserable life in a concrete cell." I stood up quickly and blocked his path to the patrol car. I placed my hand firmly on his broad shoulder. "No, Tom." I commanded, my tone completely stripping away his authority and halting him in his tracks. "You are not calling dispatch. You are not going to arrest him today." Tom looked at me as if I had truly lost my mind. "Hank, he tried to kill you," Tom argued forcefully, pointing back toward the city. "He is currently committing massive fraud against the state. We have to shut this entire circus down immediately." I shook my head slowly, a cold, calculating smile forming on my face. "If you arrest him today, he gets a minor slap on the wrist," I explained, outlining the precise mechanics of my retaliation. "A smart, expensive defense lawyer will claim he panicked during a highly emotional family argument. They will plead the charges down to criminal negligence or reckless endangerment. He might serve 3 soft years and then walk free. I refuse to let him off that easily." I pointed at the legal petition in my hand. "I want you to look at the sheer magnitude of what he is attempting to do, Tom. He is walking into a courtroom to commit federal perjury under oath. He is trying to leverage a house he does not legally own to secure massive commercial loans. The exact moment a judge signs this conservatorship order, every single financial move Derek makes becomes a massive multi-state federal conspiracy. If we stop him right now, he is just a very bad son. If we let him proceed, he becomes a federal inmate facing 20 years without the absolute possibility of parole." Tom stared at me, the fiery fury in his eyes slowly shifting into a deep, profound understanding. He recognized the ruthless, cold logic of a man who had spent his entire life diagnosing and dismantling complex systems. I was intentionally allowing the defective engine to run at maximum capacity until it catastrophically destroyed itself from the inside out. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Hank?" Tom finally asked, his voice dropping to a quiet, conspiratorial whisper. I looked out at the towering green pine trees, feeling the cool mountain breeze wash over my face. "I need you to keep a temporary secret," I replied firmly. "I need you to get back in your cruiser and drive away. You never came to this isolated cabin. You never saw me standing on this porch. For the next few days, I need the entire world to firmly believe that Hank Caldwell is nothing more than a pile of bones buried under the Mojave sand. Let my son walk into that courtroom and legally hang himself with his own fabricated lies. When the trap finally snaps shut, I promise you the devastation will be absolute and inescapable." Tom stood silently on the porch, weighing the massive legal and moral implications of my unorthodox request. He looked at the fraudulent court documents in my hand, and then back at the cold, unwavering determination burning in my eyes. He slowly put his uniform hat back on his head and nodded once. A sharp, definitive gesture of total agreement. "You are officially a ghost, Hank," Tom said, walking down the wooden steps toward his dusty patrol car. "But when you finally decide to come back from the dead, you make sure that boy feels every single ounce of the hell he put you through." I watched the sheriff back his cruiser out of the dirt yard and disappear down the winding mountain road. The loud sound of the gravel crunching slowly faded back into the absolute silence of the wilderness. The first pivotal phase of my retaliation was successfully secured. My son firmly believed he had stolen my life and secured his golden future. He had absolutely no idea that he was simply gathering the heavy firewood for his own public funeral pyre. The heavy wooden door of the hunting cabin was bolted shut against the freezing mountain wind. The only light in the room came from the bright, glowing screen of my rugged laptop sitting on the rough-hewn dining table. Bill was asleep in the back room. I was completely alone, with the overwhelming silence of the timberland woods. The physical pain from the desert heat still burned deep inside my muscles, but my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. It was time to see exactly what was happening inside the house I had bled for 40 years to pay off. Derek and Chloe firmly believed I was a technological dinosaur. They thought a man who spent his life fixing heavy diesel engines and turning grease-covered wrenches had absolutely no concept of modern electronics. They assumed my understanding of the world stopped at carburetors and hydraulic pumps. That was a catastrophic underestimation of my abilities. A master mechanic does not just turn bolts. A master mechanic understands complex diagnostic systems, electrical routing, and digital telemetry. Integrating a covert surveillance network into my own home was a straightforward and simple task. I did not install the cameras because I was paranoid or crazy. I installed them 6 months ago because things had started quietly disappearing from my house. It began with small, seemingly insignificant items. A silver serving spoon here, a vintage crystal vase there. But then I noticed a piece of my late wife Martha's antique silver collection was missing from the locked mahogany display cabinet. That silver was a family heirloom passed down through generations. It meant the absolute world to Martha. I knew instantly that Derek would never steal it. He simply did not care about antiques or family history. But Chloe had always looked at our belongings with a thinly veiled, predatory hunger. I knew she was quietly pawning my wife's precious memories to fund her endless luxury shopping sprees. To protect Martha's legacy, I had spent 2 long weekends wiring high-definition microcameras into the infrastructure of my home. I embedded them behind the plastic grating of the air conditioning vents. I tucked them inside the hollowed-out casings of the smoke detectors. I placed one perfectly inside the spine of a massive dictionary on the living room bookshelf. The entire network was hardwired to an encrypted server hidden in the basement drywall, routing directly to my secure cloud account. It was completely invisible to the naked eye. I sat in the dark, cold cabin and typed my long authentication credentials into the keyboard. The software loaded with a soft digital chime. A green progress bar filled the screen, and suddenly the monitor split into a grid of 6 high-definition live video feeds. I was looking directly into the heart of my own home from 100 miles away. A naive part of me still held on to a tiny fragment of hope. The fragile remains of a father's heart, expected to see a house in deep mourning. I expected to see the local police standing in the foyer asking questions. I expected to see my son pacing the floor with a terrified expression holding a phone to his ear, desperately waiting for the search and rescue teams to call with good news. I expected to see a family shattered by the tragic disappearance of their patriarch. What I actually saw made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. The primary camera feed covering the expansive living room was brightly illuminated. The house was not a quiet sanctuary of grief. It was the staging ground for a loud, arrogant celebration. Loud, upbeat pop music was pulsing from the expensive wireless speakers Derek had installed on the mantel. The room was packed with people. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, resting my calloused hands heavily on the wooden table. I recognized the faces immediately. They were Derek and Chloe's pretentious country club friends. These were the elite, wealthy socialites who had always looked down their noses at my blue-collar roots. They were men wearing tailored golf shirts, and women dripping in gaudy, expensive jewelry. They were standing on my polished hardwood floors, laughing out loud and clinking expensive crystal glasses together. They were throwing a party, a morbidly cheerful, sickening celebration of my supposed death. I watched in absolute, unadulterated disgust as Derek walked confidently through the crowded room. He was not wearing the dark clothes of a devastated, grieving son. He was wearing a crisp, white, button-down shirt, with a relaxed, confident smile plastered across his face. He looked exactly like a man who had just won the state lottery. He walked over to this custom wet bar I had built with my own 2 hands. I watched him reach up to the very top shelf and grab a specific heavy glass bottle. It was my prized 20-year-old reserve bourbon. That was a bottle my union brothers had bought for me on the day I officially retired from the mining company. It was incredibly expensive and highly sentimental. I had been saving it for a profound family milestone, perhaps the birth of a grandchild or my 70th birthday. Derek unscrewed the cork without a single ounce of hesitation or respect. He poured generous amounts of my prized bourbon into heavy rocks glasses and handed them out to his wealthy friends. I reached forward and turned up the volume on the encrypted audio feed. The crisp, clear sound of their voices instantly filled the quiet air of the hunting cabin. "Here is to new beginnings and prime real estate," a tall man in a pink polo shirt announced, raising his glass of my bourbon high into the air. "We are so relieved for you, Derek. It is a tragedy, of course, but at least the financial burden is finally lifted off your shoulders." Derek took a long, arrogant sip of the stolen liquor. He shook his head, pretending to look solemnly at the floor, but his triumphant smile completely betrayed him. "It is exactly what my father would have wanted," Derek lied, his voice completely steady and utterly devoid of any shame or guilt. His mind was slipping so fast these last few months. It was honestly a mercy that the desert took him quickly before he could suffer in a care facility. Now Chloe and I can finally focus on upgrading this property and building our actual future without being held back. Chloe was standing right beside him, wearing a designer dress that undoubtedly cost more than an entire month of my hard-earned pension. She laughed a sharp, shrill sound that made my stomach physically churn. She leaned into the group of women surrounding her, pointing aggressively at my brick fireplace and my custom oak bookcases. "We are gutting the entire interior by next month," Chloe bragged loudly, ensuring everyone in the room could hear her clearly. "We are bringing in a premium contractor to tear out all this depressing, outdated wood. I cannot wait to scrub the blue-collar stench out of these walls once and for all. We are turning this place into a proper modern estate fit for entertaining." I sat perfectly still in the wooden chair watching them dance and drink on the grave they had eagerly dug for me. The sheer magnitude of their callousness was breathtaking to witness. They were dividing my kingdom and spending my money before the authorities had even officially called off the search for my body. But the final unforgivable blow was yet to come. As the evening wore on, and the country club guests began to filter out of the front door, the house grew significantly quieter. I clicked the computer mouse and maximized the camera feed located inside the master bedroom. It was the room Martha and I had shared for 3 beautiful decades. It was a sacred space filled with memories of whispered late-night conversations and quiet Sunday mornings. Derek and Chloe walked into the bedroom. The fake polite smiles they wore for their wealthy guests vanished instantly. They shifted seamlessly from gracious hosts into ravenous scavenging predators. Chloe marched directly toward the large cedar chest sitting at the foot of my bed. That chest was built from solid wood, and it held Martha's most cherished creations. Martha had spent countless hours sitting in her rocking chair, meticulously hand-stitching heavy, beautiful quilts for the annual church bazaar. She poured her absolute soul into those fabrics, sewing intricate patterns that told the story of our family and our faith. When she passed away, I kept her 3 favorite quilts perfectly folded inside that cedar chest. They still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume. They were the absolute most valuable things I owned, because they represented the warmth and love of the woman who made my life worth living. Chloe violently kicked the heavy wooden lid of the cedar chest open. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a roll of heavy-duty black contractor trash bags. She snapped a massive plastic bag open with a loud cracking sound that echoed through the hidden microphone. I watched through the high-definition monitor as she aggressively grabbed Martha's beautiful hand-stitched quilts. She did not fold them. She did not handle them with any degree of care or respect. She bundled them up in her fists like dirty rags and forcefully shoved them deep into the black garbage bag. "What are you doing with those?" Derek asked, standing near the doorway with his hands in his pockets. "I am throwing them in the dumpster where they belong," Chloe sneered, her face twisting with profound disgust. "I am not keeping this cheap blue-collar garbage in my newly renovated house. It smells like a dusty thrift store in here. We need to clear out all the old junk before the interior designers arrive on Monday morning." My breathing stopped completely. My eyes locked onto the glowing screen recording every single frame of the absolute desecration. I waited for my son to step forward. I waited for the boy who used to sleep under those exact same quilts when he had a terrible winter fever to finally show a shred of basic human decency. I waited for him to grab the trash bag out of her hands and defend his mother's sacred memory. Derek looked down at the black plastic garbage bag. He looked at the intricately stitched fabric spilling out over the top. Then he looked at his wife and offered a weak, pathetic, compliant nod. "You are right," Derek muttered, turning his back on his mother's profound legacy. "Get rid of all of it. We do not need any of this old clutter weighing us down anymore." He walked into the master bathroom and closed the door without uttering another word. I sat alone in the remote mountain cabin staring at the glowing computer screen. I did not scream. I did not throw my ceramic coffee mug against the log walls. I did not shed a single tear for the son I had permanently lost. The profound, agonizing pain that had been weighing down my chest since the moment he shoved me out of the car in the blistering desert instantly vaporized. In its place, a freezing, diamond-hard anger took root deep inside my soul. It was a terrifyingly calm and highly calculated fury. The remaining illusion of family completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Derek had not just tried to kill me to steal a house and cover his debts. He was actively and eagerly participating in the absolute erasure of my wife's beautiful existence. He was allowing a parasitic grifter to throw the very fabric of our family history into a filthy landfill just to secure a fleeting moment of social approval from a woman who did not even love him. I slowly reached out and closed the lid of the rugged laptop. The bright glow of the screen faded, leaving me in the dark shadows of the silent cabin. My anger had crystallized into pure, weaponized focus. I was no longer a grieving father desperately trying to understand why his only son had violently betrayed him. I was a master mechanic assessing a catastrophically failed machine. When a complex heavy-duty system rots entirely from the inside out, you do not try to patch the leaking hoses. You do not try to salvage the broken, rusted gears. You take a heavy sledgehammer and you smash the entire defective engine into unrecognizable scrap metal. Derek and Chloe wanted to live like wealthy elites. They wanted to steal my home drink, my prized bourbon, and throw my beautiful Martha's memory into the trash without facing a single consequence. They firmly believed they had executed the perfect, flawless crime. They thought the old man was dead and buried permanently under the scorching Mojave sand. They had absolutely no idea that the ghost they created was currently sitting in the dark, watching their every move and preparing to unleash a legal and financial inferno that would burn their stolen kingdom straight down to the bedrock. The time for mourning and shock was over. It was time to go to war. The cold light of the rugged laptop screen cast a harsh blue glow against the heavy log walls of the hunting cabin. My chest was still tight, radiating a dull, heavy ache from watching my daughter-in-law violently shove my late wife's beautiful hand-stitched quilts into a black garbage bag. But I did not have the luxury of sitting in the dark and nursing a broken heart. A mechanic does not walk away from a machine just because the diagnostic test reveals a catastrophic failure. You wipe the grease from your eyes, you shine a brighter light into the engine block, and you find the exact severed wire that caused the entire system to burn down. I reached out with my calloused fingers and tapped the keyboard. I switched the primary surveillance feed away from the desecrated master bedroom and clicked on the camera hidden inside my home office. This was the room where I had spent countless late nights balancing the household budget, carefully calculating overtime hours to ensure Derek's college tuition was paid in full. It was a room built on hard work and honest arithmetic. Now it was occupied by a terrified, sweating criminal. Derek paced frantically back and forth across the woven area rug. His crisp white dress shirt, which he had worn so proudly during his morbid celebration party just an hour ago, was now completely unbuttoned at the collar. The sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, and his hair was a disheveled mess from constantly running his shaking hands through it. The arrogant, triumphant son, who had strutted around my living room pouring my prized vintage bourbon for his wealthy friends, was entirely gone. In his place was a cornered, desperate animal. I leaned closer to the monitor, turning the volume dial on the encrypted audio feed all the way to maximum. I needed to hear every single breath. Derek marched over to the heavy oak desk, grabbed his smartphone, and dialed a number. He pressed the phone hard against his ear, his breathing ragged and shallow. He paced toward the window, peering out through the wooden blinds into the dark suburban street, double-checking to ensure no one was watching him. He was completely oblivious to the digital eye burning a hole directly into his back from the bookshelf behind him. "Pick up the phone," Derek muttered to himself, his voice trembling with a high-pitched, nervous energy. "Come on, pick up the absolute phone." The line finally connected. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a groggy voice on the other end. "Listen to me," Derek snapped, dropping his voice into a harsh, frantic whisper. "I do not care what time it is. We have a massive problem. You need to log into the central accounting server right now and place a hard administrative lock on the third quarter reconciliation files." There was a pause as the person on the other end responded. Derek's face contorted into a mask of pure panic. "Do not give me that corporate compliance garbage," Derek hissed, gripping the edge of the oak desk so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. "You are the junior ledger analyst. You have back-end access. If the senior partners run the preliminary audit sweep tomorrow morning, they are going to see the discrepancy in the holding accounts. They are going to see that $84,000 is completely missing from the client escrow fund." My blood ran entirely cold. I sat perfectly still in the wooden chair inside the quiet mountain cabin. The missing puzzle piece suddenly dropped into place with the heavy, undeniable thud of a steel vault door locking shut. My son did not owe $84,000 to a legitimate commercial bank. He had not taken out a bad business loan or fallen behind on a massive tax lien. He had embezzled corporate funds. He had stolen money directly from his own investment firm. He had illegally routed client escrow capital into his own personal accounts. "I know it is a felony," Derek screamed into the phone, losing all composure. "Do you think I do not know that? I am the one who authorized the wire transfers. But I am telling you I have the capital secured. I just need a 48-hour delay. I have full legal conservatorship over my father's estate now. The paperwork was approved. I am securing a $250,000 home equity line of credit against his house first thing on Monday. The moment the bank clears the commercial loan, I will wire the $84,000 directly back into the client escrow account. No one will ever know it was gone." The voice on the other end of the line was clearly refusing to participate in the cover-up. The junior analyst was terrified. "You cannot back out on me now," Derek pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "If the firm discovers the missing capital, they are not just going to fire me, they are going to call the federal authorities. I will go to state prison for grand larceny and embezzlement. I will lose my entire life. Just push the audit to Tuesday. Please." The call abruptly disconnected. Derek stared at the blank screen of his smartphone, his chest heaving with sheer terror. He let out a primal, frustrated scream and violently hurled the expensive phone across the room. It smashed aggressively against the brick wall, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of cracked glass before dropping to the carpet. The loud, destructive crash echoed through the quiet house. Seconds later, the heavy brass doorknob of the home office rattled violently. The door swung open and Chloe marched into the room. She was no longer carrying a black garbage bag filled with my late wife's memories. She was holding a half-empty glass of expensive wine, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She looked at the shattered phone on the carpet and then glared at her husband with an expression of profound, unadulterated contempt. "What is your absolute problem?" Chloe demanded aggressively, crossing her arms over her expensive silk dress. "We have important guests in the living room celebrating our new financial freedom, and you are in here having a pathetic, childish meltdown. Pull yourself together, Derek. You are embarrassing me." Derek spun around to face his wife. The sheer panic in his eyes instantly transmuted into a wild, explosive rage. "I am embarrassing you," Derek shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at her face. "I am looking at 10 to 20 years in a maximum security state prison because of you." The junior analyst just hung up on me. He is refusing to block the corporate ledger. The partners are running a massive company-wide forensic audit on Monday morning. If that commercial loan against my father's house does not clear the bank by Monday afternoon, the firm is going to see the missing $84,000. Chloe rolled her eyes, taking a casual, dismissive sip of her wine. "You are being completely dramatic," she scoffed, waving her manicured hand in the air. "You just got the emergency conservatorship approved. The judge gave you total control over the old man's assets. You literally own his house now. Just go to the commercial lender tomorrow and force them to expedite the wire transfer. You are a financial consultant. Act like one and fix the problem." "I did not steal that money from the firm to fund a bad investment," Derek screamed, stepping aggressively into her personal space. "I diverted those client funds to cover your disastrous cryptocurrency margin calls. You blew $50,000 trying to day trade digital coins you knew absolutely nothing about. And when you lost it all, you went out and bought $30,000 worth of designer handbags and luxury resort vacations just to keep up appearances with your arrogant friends." The brutal, unvarnished truth hung in the air of my home office, captured perfectly by the hidden surveillance microphones. My son was not a victim of a shifting economy. He was a spineless, enabling coward who had committed massive corporate fraud to satisfy the insatiable, bottomless greed of his materialistic wife. He had risked his entire career, his freedom and his father's life, just to ensure Chloe could continue playing the role of a wealthy socialite at the country club. "Do not dare stand there and blame me for your lack of earning potential," Chloe snapped back, her voice dripping with sheer venom. "When I married you, you promised me a specific lifestyle. You promised me we would not end up living like your pathetic, penny-pinching, blue-collar parents. If you had just made partner at the firm like you were supposed to, we would not be in this mess. I did what I had to do to maintain our social standing." Derek stared at her, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "You threatened to leave me," he whispered, his voice completely hollowed out by fear. "You told me if we lost the country club membership, you would file for divorce and take half of my future earnings. You forced my hand." "I did not force you to do anything," Chloe replied, her tone as cold and hard as shattered glass. "I simply established my standards. You are the one who chose to embezzle the money. You are the one who drove your father out into the middle of the lethal desert heat and dumped him on the side of the highway so you could steal his house. You made those choices, Derek. Do not try to pin your criminal behavior on my shopping habits." The sheer breathtaking sociopathy of her statement echoed through the speakers of my laptop. She knew exactly what he had done. She knew that Derek had intentionally abandoned me in a 113-degree desert wasteland. She was fully aware that they had effectively orchestrated my murder, and she felt absolutely no remorse. She viewed my death as a convenient, necessary transaction to balance her luxury credit card statements. "We just need the bank to clear the home equity loan by Monday," Derek muttered, pacing the room again, desperately trying to convince himself that his catastrophic plan could still work. "If the bank wires the $250,000 against the house, I can replace the $84,000 at the firm, pay off the high-interest credit cards, and we will still have over $100,000 left in cash to renovate the property. We just need to survive until Monday." Sitting in the dark silence of the hunting cabin, the entire mechanical blueprint of their betrayal was suddenly illuminated in my mind. The desert abandonment was not just an act of casual, opportunistic greed. It was an act of pure, frantic, animalistic self-preservation. Derek had backed himself into an inescapable legal corner. He knew the massive corporate forensic audit was scheduled for Monday morning. He knew that if he did not replace the embezzled funds before the auditors opened the ledgers, he would be arrested, prosecuted, and locked in a state penitentiary for decades. He was out of time. He could not wait for me to pass away naturally. He could not wait for a standard, lengthy legal battle over a traditional loan. He needed a massive influx of untraceable liquid cash in less than 48 hours. And the only viable asset he had access to was the massive unencumbered equity sitting completely paid off in my suburban home. But to get that equity, he needed the deed. To get the deed, he needed absolute power of attorney. And to get the power of attorney approved by a judge on an emergency expedited basis, he needed to prove that his father was either entirely mentally incompetent or dead. He had driven me out into the Mojave Desert specifically to manufacture a life-threatening crisis. He wanted the police to find my sun-baked body, or at the very least to officially declare me a wandering, hopelessly lost dementia patient. He used my fabricated disappearance as the legal leverage to force the county judge to grant him immediate, unquestioned control over my entire life's work. My son had sacrificed my life to save his own skin. I watched the surveillance feed as Chloe smoothed the front of her expensive silk dress and offered her husband a cold, manipulative smile. "Just take a deep breath, fix your collar, and come back out to the party," Chloe ordered, turning toward the door. "Stop acting like a terrified child. You own this house now. The old man is gone. The money will clear the bank on Monday, and everything will be perfectly fine. We won." She walked out of the office, leaving Derek standing alone in the center of the room. He stared down at his shaking hands, desperately trying to pull himself together before returning to his wealthy guests. I slowly reached out and muted the audio feed on my laptop. The dense, heavy silence of the Timberland mountains rushed back into the room, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove burning in the corner. My jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. The sheer relief I felt was intoxicating. I finally understood the exact parameters of the battlefield. Derek and Chloe were completely reliant on a singular, desperate timeline. Their entire survival hinged on the commercial bank approving that home equity loan against my property before Monday morning. They firmly believed they had executed a flawless, undetectable crime. They thought they were holding a winning lottery ticket. They had absolutely no idea that the ticket was completely void. They did not know that I had already scheduled a secret meeting with my estate attorney to initiate a silent, lethal financial ambush. I was not going to stop Derek from walking into that commercial bank. I was going to let him sit down in a plush leather chair, smile at the loan officer, and legally sign his name to a massive stack of federal banking documents. I was going to let him commit aggravated multi-state bank fraud in permanent ink. My son was racing against a ticking clock to escape a state prison sentence for embezzlement. I was going to gladly hold the door open for him, and then I was going to lock him inside a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The morning sun barely crested the pine trees outside the hunting cabin, but I was already wide awake, staring intensely at the glowing laptop screen. The heavy ceramic coffee mug in my hand had gone stone cold hours ago. Beside me, my brother-in-law Bill sat leaning forward, his large calloused hands resting heavily on the rough wooden table. We were watching the live surveillance feed from my living room, and the sickening reality of my son's grand plan was unfolding right before our eyes in stunning high definition. A sleek silver luxury sedan pulled into my driveway. It did not belong to Derek or Chloe. I recognized that car immediately. It belonged to Chloe's parents, Preston and Cynthia. They were the exact kind of people who wore expensive cashmere sweaters to backyard barbecues and spoke with an unnatural, practiced cadence designed entirely to make working-class people feel exceptionally small. For years, they had looked down their noses at me. They saw my grease-stained hands and my diesel-scented work boots not as the proud marks of a hard-working provider, but as a shameful lower-class disease that their daughter had unfortunately married into. But I knew their dirty little secret. I knew that beneath the imported silk and the designer sunglasses, Preston and Cynthia were absolutely drowning in debt. They were financially ruined socialites who had mortgaged their own property to the hilt just to maintain the shallow, hollow illusion of elite wealth. Now, they were stepping out of their vehicle and walking up to my front porch, completely unaware that the man they thought was dead was watching their every single move. I watched through the camera feed as Derek eagerly threw the front door open. He did not look like a man whose father had supposedly wandered off and died in the brutal Mojave heat just a few days prior. He looked like a pathetic, eager bellhop, welcoming very important guests into a luxury resort. Preston and Cynthia did not offer him a hug or a single word of condolences. They did not even pretend to mourn my passing. They simply handed Derek their heavy leather suitcases and marched directly inside. My chest tightened into a hard, painful knot as I watched them drag their massive rolling luggage right across the polished hardwood floors of my foyer. Those were the exact same floors I had painstakingly laid down board by board, working until midnight for 3 straight months, so my late wife Martha could have the beautiful entryway she had always dreamed of. Preston's hard leather shoe soles scuffed the pristine wood, but he did not care. He was aggressively marking his territory. They did not stop in the guest room. I felt the air leave my lungs completely as I switched the camera feed to the master bedroom. Chloe was standing in the doorway, ushering her parents directly into the sacred private space that Martha and I had shared for over 30 years. Cynthia casually tossed her expensive handbag onto the bed, where my wife had taken her final breath. They were not just stopping by to offer moral support. They were moving in. They were actively claiming the master suite of a house they did not own, acting like conquering royalty occupying a captured castle. Bill let out a low, dangerous growl from the chair beside me. "That is Martha's room," Bill whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, violent, protective rage. They are throwing their dirty luggage on my sister's bed. I did not say a word. I simply kept my eyes locked on the monitor, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth began to physically ache. I watched Cynthia open the heavy oak closet doors. She began ruthlessly shoving my remaining work jackets and flannel shirts to the side, aggressively clearing space for her own extravagant wardrobe. She treated the very fabric of my life like a temporary nuisance that needed to be promptly discarded. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect escalated rapidly. A few minutes later, the camera in the living room captured the entire group gathering near the brick fireplace. Cynthia pulled a digital laser tape measure from her pocket. She aimed the red beam across the room, calculating the square footage with a cold, predatory focus. "This entire layout is absolutely claustrophobic," Cynthia announced loudly, her shrill voice echoing clearly through the hidden microphone. "We need to tear down this hideous stone fireplace immediately. It looks like a cheap rustic hunting lodge, and these heavy oak panels have got to go. We will hire a contractor to gut this entire floor on Monday. We can paint everything a crisp, modern white to wash out that lingering blue-collar stench." Preston nodded in agreement, swirling a glass of my top-shelf bourbon in his hand. "The foundation is solid, but the aesthetic is incredibly low class," he remarked, looking around my home with blatant disgust. "It is amazing what a $250,000 renovation can do to a property like this. Once the home equity loan clears the bank, we will transform this tacky little shack into a proper estate." I felt a sickening physical revulsion wash over my entire body. They were standing in the very center of the home I had bled for openly mocking the life I had built. Every stone in that fireplace had been carried and mortared by my own 2 hands. Every piece of oak trim had been selected and sanded by Martha. They were casually plotting to erase our entire existence to satisfy their hollow, superficial vanity. But the absolute worst part of the surveillance footage was not the vile insults spewed by the in-laws. It was the pathetic, submissive reaction of my own son. Derek stood right beside them, holding a silver serving tray of drinks. He heard them blatantly insult his mother's taste. He heard them mock the father who had sacrificed everything to put him through college. A man with even a single drop of integrity would have thrown the tray on the floor and ordered them out of his childhood home immediately. Instead, Derek offered a weak, subservient smile and nodded his head frantically. "You are entirely right, Cynthia." Derek agreed, his voice dripping with eager desperation. "The interior is horribly outdated. As soon as the bank wires the equity funds to my account, I will give you full creative control over the renovation budget. We are going to erase all this old junk and start fresh." The betrayal was absolute and complete. Derek was enthusiastically handing the sledgehammer to the very people who wanted to destroy our family legacy. He had traded his soul, his father, and his mother's memory for a fleeting pat on the back from 2 financially ruined frauds. He was a coward of the highest order, desperate to buy his way into a toxic family dynamic that would never truly accept him. Beside me, the wooden chair violently scraped backward across the cabin floor. Bill shot to his feet, his large chest heaving with an uncontrollable, righteous fury. His face was flushed crimson, and the veins in his thick neck were bulging against his skin. "That is it!" Bill roared, his voice shaking the very walls of the small hunting cabin. "I am not sitting here watching these arrogant, thieving parasites insult my dead sister and spit on your grave." Bill stomped across the room and aggressively grabbed his heavy steel truck keys off the kitchen counter. He reached into the corner near the door and wrapped his massive hand around the handle of a solid ash wood baseball bat he kept for home defense. "I am driving down that mountain right now," Bill snarled, his eyes burning with a blind, protective rage. "I am going to kick that front door completely off its hinges. I am going to drag that ungrateful, treacherous boy out onto the front lawn by his expensive collar, and then I am going to show those elitist snobs exactly what blue-collar trash looks like when you desecrate our family." I stood up from the computer desk with lightning speed. Despite the lingering physical exhaustion from my survival in the desert, the adrenaline surging through my veins gave me immense strength. I stepped directly into Bill's path, placing my body squarely between him and the cabin door. I pressed both of my hands firmly against his broad chest, halting his furious momentum. "Put the bat down, Bill!" I commanded, my voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register that carried absolute, unquestionable authority. "You are not getting in that truck, and you are not driving down to that house." Bill glared down at me, his grip tightening on the wooden bat. "Hank, get out of my way," he growled, his voice thick with emotional pain. "You saw what they are doing. You heard what they called Martha's home. They are actively destroying everything you two built together. I am going to break every single bone in Derek's body for what he did to you out there on that highway." I did not flinch. I did not move a single inch. I looked my brother-in-law directly in the eyes, channeling every ounce of cold, mechanical logic I possessed. If you drive down there with a weapon and bash his teeth in, what exactly happens next? I asked, forcing him to confront the absolute reality of the situation. "Derek will call the police. You will be arrested for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, armed burglary, and trespassing. You will go to a state penitentiary for 10 years, and Derek will play the battered, victimized son for the local news cameras. The judge will grant him a permanent restraining order, and he will still get the money. He wins, Bill. If you let your anger control you tonight, they win everything." Bill's jaw clenched tightly, but he stopped pushing against my hands. The heavy, ragged sound of his breathing filled the small space between us. I lowered my hands, keeping my intense gaze locked firmly onto his. "I am not going to let them get away with this," I promised, my voice carrying the freezing, undeniable weight of a permanent consequence. "But we are not going to fight them like street thugs. We are going to fight them like architects." I pointed back toward the glowing screen of the laptop resting on the dining table. "Look at what they are doing right now," I explained meticulously, laying out the precise parameters of the trap. "They are measuring walls and picking out paint colors for a house they believe they own. Derek is banking his entire freedom, his absolute survival, on that $250,000 home equity loan clearing the commercial bank on Monday. He needs that money to cover the corporate embezzlement before his firm audits the ledgers." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the table, closing the distance to the screen. To get that loan, Derek had to submit the forged emergency conservatorship documents to the bank. He had to swear under penalty of federal perjury that I am medically incapacitated and that he has the legal right to leverage my estate. He is currently transmitting fraudulent financial claims across state lines using digital banking networks. I turned back to face Bill, a cold, predatory smile slowly forming on my face. A simple trespassing charge, or an assault and battery arrest, is entirely too good for them. We do not want them for a local domestic dispute, Bill. We want them for massive multi-state federal fraud. We want them for aggravated identity theft and felony embezzlement. The sheer devastating magnitude of my strategy finally began to penetrate Bill's blinding rage. He looked at the baseball bat in his hand, realizing how small and ineffective physical violence was compared to the absolute life-ruining destruction I was actively orchestrating. "I want Derek to sit down in a plush leather chair on Monday morning and happily sign his name to the final bank distribution paperwork." I continued, my voice practically vibrating with dark anticipation. "I want him to legally and permanently bind himself to a massive federal conspiracy. I want Chloe and her arrogant, bankrupt parents to try and wire that stolen equity into their offshore accounts. I want them to feel the absolute, intoxicating thrill of total victory just seconds before the federal authorities kick their doors down and freeze every single asset they possess." Bill slowly lowered the wooden bat, letting the heavy barrel rest against the floorboards. The crimson flush of anger began to fade from his face, replaced by a deep, profound understanding of the lethal trap I had constructed. He realized I was not acting out of cowardice or hesitation. I was exhibiting the terrifying, disciplined patience of a sniper, waiting for the perfect, undeniable shot. "You are going to let them build their own prison," Bill whispered, staring at the live surveillance feed of the intruders celebrating in my living room. "I am going to hand them the bricks and the mortar," I replied, walking back over to the laptop and sitting down in front of the monitors. "And when they finally lock themselves inside, I am going to throw away the key forever." We spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, silent cabin, watching the parasites infest my home. I did not feel another ounce of sorrow or heartbreak. The man who had loved Derek was permanently dead, left behind in the scorching heat of the Mojave Desert. The man who returned was a cold, calculating machine, and I was going to ensure that my son faced the absolute catastrophic consequences of his greed. The heavy mountain fog was still clinging to the towering pine trees when I left the remote hunting cabin early Monday morning. I did not pack a bag. I did not take anything that would weigh me down. I wore a simple, clean button-down shirt and a pair of sturdy denim jeans. I left Bill sitting in the dark glow of the computer monitors, instructed to keep a vigilant, unblinking eye on every single move my son and his parasitic in-laws made inside my home. I borrowed Bill's battered spare pickup truck and began the long, winding drive down the mountain and back toward the sprawling concrete grid of the city. My physical body was still aching deeply from the blistering desert heat, but my mind was operating with the cold, frictionless precision of a newly oiled piston. I was not driving back to my house in the suburbs. I was driving directly into the towering glass and steel financial district of downtown. I parked the rusted pickup truck in a subterranean parking garage filled with sleek imported luxury cars and took the private elevator up to the 34th floor. I walked into the plush, silent reception area of a premier corporate law firm. I did not have an appointment, but I did not need one. The man I was there to see had handled the complex, quiet patents I secured decades ago for industrial mining equipment. His name was Victor Sterling. Victor was not a friendly small-town family lawyer who handled simple wills and traffic tickets. He was a ruthless, highly aggressive corporate litigator who specialized in absolute financial demolition. He was a man who wore $5,000 suits and dismantled fraudulent corporations before his morning coffee. When the receptionist ushered me into his sprawling corner office, Victor stood up from behind his massive mahogany desk. "Hank Victor," said, extending a firm hand, his sharp eyes immediately scanning my weathered face. "I was not expecting you today. Is everything completely secure with the trust accounts?" I shook his hand, sitting down in the heavy leather chair opposite his desk. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I looked him dead in the eye and laid out the entire sickening reality of the past 48 hours. I told him about the $84,000 corporate embezzlement Derek was desperately trying to cover up. I told him about the fraudulent emergency conservatorship my son was pushing through the county courts, using a fabricated dementia diagnosis. And I told him exactly how my son had shoved me out of a luxury vehicle into a 113-degree desert wasteland, fully expecting me to bake to death in the dirt just so he could seize my equity. Victor sat perfectly still, his pen hovering above his legal pad. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the low, steady hum of the central air conditioning. The professional, detached composure he usually maintained completely fractured. His jaw tightened into a hard, unforgiving line, and a dark, dangerous fire ignited in his eyes. "Your own son intentionally drove you into the Mojave and left you there to die?" Victor asked, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying register. "He abandoned you to cover his own felony embezzlement, and now he is actively petitioning a judge to declare you legally incompetent." I nodded once, my expression entirely devoid of emotion. "Yes, Victor. He thinks I am either dead or aimlessly wandering the sand. He thinks he has completely won. He needs to secure a massive home equity line of credit against my house by this afternoon to replace the stolen corporate funds before his firm audits their ledgers on Monday morning. Victor immediately reached for his desk phone, his fingers flying across the keypad. "I am calling the federal authorities right now." "Hank." Victor declared, his voice clipping the silent air of the room. "We will have a tactical team at your house before noon. We will arrest him for attempted murder, elder abuse, and filing a fraudulent court petition. We will freeze him out before he can even approach a commercial lender." I leaned forward and pressed my calloused hand down hard onto the receiver, physically disconnecting the call. Victor looked at me completely bewildered. "No," I commanded, my voice resonating with the absolute uncompromising authority of a man who had already made his final decision. "We are not calling the police. We are not stopping him from going to the bank." Victor stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "Hank, if we do not block this conservatorship filing today, the judge is going to grant him total unrestricted legal authority over your entire life. He will have the legal right to sign your name to any document he wants. He will leverage your house, drain the equity, and hand it straight over to his wife's bankrupt parents. You cannot let him put a lien on the home you and Martha built." I leaned back in the leather chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "I want him to get the conservatorship," I explained, laying out the mechanical blueprint of my trap with chilling clarity. "If we arrest him right now, he is just a desperate guy who filed a false police report and had a terrible domestic dispute. His high-priced defense attorney will spin a pathetic story to the jury. They will claim he panicked, that he was under immense financial pressure, and that he made a temporary, emotional mistake. He will get a slap on the wrist, a few years of probation, and he will walk away to ruin someone else's life." I pointed a thick, rough finger at the legal pad on Victor's desk. "I do not want him to get probation, Victor. I want him absolutely, completely, and irreversibly destroyed. And to do that, I need to let him walk into that commercial bank today. I need him to sit down with a loan officer and happily sign his name to a stack of federal lending documents." Victor slowly set his pen down, the sheer devastating magnitude of my strategy finally beginning to register in his sharp, legal mind. "You want him to commit aggravated bank fraud?" Victor whispered, a slow, predatory smile beginning to form on his lips. "Exactly," I confirmed, locking my gaze onto his. "But to make the trap completely inescapable, we have to make sure he is leveraging a house that he has absolutely no legal right to touch. I need you to pull the deed to my property right now. I want to transfer the entire estate, the house, the land, everything out of my personal name entirely." Victor's eyes widened with brilliant realization. He stood up and began pacing the length of his sprawling office, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished hardwood. He understood the assignment perfectly. "We need a blind corporate entity," Victor stated, his mind racing through the legal architecture. "We will establish an anonymous limited liability company registered in a completely different state. We will name the corporation something entirely unassuming, like Apex Industrial Holdings. You will be the sole managing director, but your name will be heavily shielded behind strict layers of corporate privacy laws." "Do it," I instructed. "Transfer the deed of my house directly into the corporation." Victor walked back to his desk and immediately began typing furiously on his computer keyboard. He was generating the complex legal paperwork with lightning speed. As he typed, he explained the beautiful lethal mechanics of the trap we were setting. "Here is why this is going to obliterate him, Hank," Victor said, never taking his eyes off the monitor. "When we file this deed transfer today, it legally and immediately strips your personal name off the property. The house will instantly belong to the corporation. However, the county recorder's office is notoriously underfunded and perpetually backlogged. It takes them at least 3 to 4 weeks to manually update the public property databases." I nodded, understanding the mechanical flaw in the bureaucratic system. "So when Derek walks into the bank this afternoon and they run a preliminary public records check, the system will still show my name on the deed." "Exactly," Victor confirmed with a sharp, satisfied nod. "The bank will look at the outdated public database. They will look at his fraudulent emergency conservatorship order, and they will blindly approve the $250,000 commercial loan." Derek will sign the federal lending contracts under penalty of perjury, formally pledging a property he believes he still controls. Victor printed the thick stack of legal documents and laid them out across the mahogany desk. But in reality, Victor continued, his voice dropping into a tone of absolute finality. Derek will be fraudulently collateralizing an asset owned by an international corporation. The second he signs that digital signature pad, he is committing massive multi-state federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He is wrapping a heavy steel chain around his own neck and handing the padlock directly to the federal government. I picked up the heavy gold-plated pen Victor offered me. I looked down at the crisp white paper. This was the quitclaim deed. This was the document that would officially transfer the home Martha and I had spent 30 years building out of my personal possession. I thought about the sweat equity I had poured into that concrete foundation. I thought about the beautiful garden Martha had planted in the backyard and the countless quiet Sunday mornings we had spent drinking coffee on the porch. A weak man would have hesitated. A sentimental fool would have clung to the physical structure, terrified of losing a building made of wood and brick. But I was not a sentimental fool. I knew that the true soul of that house had already been completely desecrated by the parasites currently occupying it. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was the ultimate weapon, and I was loading the chamber with a live round. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with bold, unwavering strokes. I signed the transfer documents, the corporate charters, and the operating agreements. With every scratch of the ink, I was sealing my son's catastrophic fate. Victor gathered the signed documents and handed them to his senior paralegal, instructing her to file them with the state registry immediately. The legal ambush was officially armed and active. The bait was resting perfectly in the center of the trap, and the predator was already circling. "How long until the bank realizes the deed is void?" I asked, leaning back in the chair. Victor sat back down, steepling his fingers together. Commercial banks move incredibly fast when they disperse funds, but their back-end audit departments always run a secondary deep-dive verification process within 48 hours of a massive equity payout. By Wednesday morning, their internal risk management algorithms will flag the discrepancy between the public record and the actual legal holding entity. And when they flag it, I prompted knowing the answer, but needing to hear the precise sequence of destruction out loud. When they flag it, the bank's automated anti-money laundering protocols will trigger a hard, catastrophic lockdown, Victor explained, his eyes glinting with a ruthless legal satisfaction. They will not send Derek a polite warning letter. They will instantly freeze every single financial account tied to his name, his wife's name, and anyone he attempted to wire the stolen money to. They will rip the funds back through the federal clearinghouses, and they will immediately contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I stood up from the leather chair, adjusting the collar of my simple button-down shirt. I looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, glittering grid of the city below. Somewhere down there in the air-conditioned lobby of a commercial lending firm, my son was proudly preparing to sign his life away. He firmly believed he was the smartest man in the room. He believed he had successfully discarded his father like a piece of useless trash and bought his way into elite society. He had absolutely no idea that the silent, invisible gears of the legal system were already turning against him. He did not know that the old diesel mechanic he had left in the dirt had just engineered the most devastating, inescapable financial collapse imaginable. "Keep a tight watch on the banking networks, Victor," I said, turning and walking slowly toward the heavy oak door of the executive office. "I'm going back to the mountains to watch the cameras. I want to see the exact look on his face when the federal guillotine finally drops." I walked out of the towering financial building and stepped back into the hot, smog-filled air of the city. The trap was set, the bait was poisoned, and the clock was loudly, irreversibly ticking down to absolute ruin. The drive back up the winding mountain road was a quiet and solitary journey. I sat behind the wheel of Bill's old pickup truck, gripping the cracked leather steering cover with hands that were finally steady. The burning aches in my joints from the desert sun were still there, but they felt distant now. They were nothing more than a dull background noise compared to the roaring furnace of focus inside my mind. When I finally pulled into the dirt yard of the hunting cabin, the heavy timberland woods were completely still. The air was crisp and freezing. I walked up the wooden steps and pushed open the heavy front door. Bill was sitting exactly where I had left him, staring intensely at the glowing laptop screens on the rough-hewn dining table. He looked up at me as I walked into the room. He did not say a word. He just pointed a thick, calloused finger at the primary surveillance monitor. I took off my jacket, draped it over the back of a wooden chair, and sat down next to him. The high-definition camera hidden inside the living room bookshelf was capturing a scene of absolute grotesque celebration. The front door of my house swung open with a violent, confident force. Derek marched into the foyer. He was not walking like a man burdened by grief or fear. He was strutting. He carried a thick black leather briefcase in his right hand, swinging it casually as if it contained the winning numbers to the state lottery. He kicked the front door shut behind him and let out a loud, triumphant shout that echoed through the entire first floor. Chloe came rushing out of the kitchen holding a glass of white wine. Her parents, Preston and Cynthia, followed closely behind her. They hovered around Derek like starving vultures waiting for a fresh piece of meat to drop. Derek tossed his heavy briefcase onto the expensive glass coffee table right in the center of the living room. He unbuttoned the top of his crisp white dress shirt and offered his wife a massive, arrogant smile. "We got it," Derek announced, his voice booming through the encrypted audio feed directly into the quiet mountain cabin. The bank approved the entire package. "We are officially liquid." Chloe let out a sharp, shrill squeal of delight and threw her arms around his neck. Preston and Cynthia clapped their hands together, exchanging greedy, satisfied looks. I sat perfectly still in the wooden chair, watching my son bask in the glory of his own treachery. He unlatched the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of crisp, white legal documents. He slammed them down onto the glass table with a loud, satisfying smack. "I want to hear every single detail," Chloe demanded, leaning over the table and eagerly tracing her manicured fingers over the printed bank logos. "Did they give you any trouble about the signature authorizations? Did they ask any questions about your father?" Derek laughed. It was a cold, heartless sound that made the remaining paternal love in my chest wither and turn to absolute ash. He shook his head and poured himself a heavy glass of my prized vintage bourbon. "They did not ask a single difficult question," he bragged, pacing around the room with his chest puffed out. I walked into the commercial lending office and played the part of the devastated, exhausted son perfectly. I handed the senior loan officer the emergency conservatorship order that the county judge signed yesterday. I slid the medical evaluation across the desk, the one claiming the old man was suffering from severe rapid-onset dementia and was legally incapacitated. Derek took a long, arrogant sip of the stolen liquor. The loan officer took one look at the police report from the Desert Search and Rescue Mission, and he practically apologized to me for the inconvenience. Derek continued, his tone dripping with absolute contempt for the people he had just manipulated. The bank did not even blink. They saw the house was completely paid off. They saw there were absolutely zero existing liens on the property. To them, it was just an unencumbered gold mine waiting to be tapped. They approved a massive $250,000 home equity line of credit right there on the spot. $250,000. Cynthia repeated, her voice trembling with sheer materialistic hunger. She looked around my living room, assessing the walls and the hardwood floors with a renewed destructive energy. "That is more than enough to cover the interior contractors and secure the landscaping crew. We can tear out this entire hideous rustic aesthetic by next week." Preston nodded, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "And what about the corporate funds?" Derek Preston asked, his voice lowering slightly, as if he suddenly remembered they were discussing a massive felony. You need to replace the money at your firm before the senior partners initiate the third-quarter forensic audit on Monday morning. If they see that $84,000 is missing from the client escrow accounts, the interior design budget is not going to matter because you will be sitting in a federal prison cell. Derek waved his hand dismissively, entirely unconcerned by the massive legal sword hanging directly over his neck. Do not worry about the firm, Preston Derek stated with total arrogant confidence. The bank expedited the underwriting process because of the emergency medical conservatorship. The funds are in a temporary holding ledger right now. All I have to do is execute the final digital signatures right here on my laptop to authorize the immediate wire transfer. The $84,000 will drop directly into my corporate escrow account by tomorrow morning. The auditors will never even know it was gone. We are completely and totally safe. I stared at the glowing monitor, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth physically ached. He was standing in the home I had bled to build, using my fake death to steal $250,000. He was casually discussing how he intended to use my life savings to cover up a felony embezzlement charge and fund his in-laws' vanity projects. The desert abandonment was not a sudden panic-induced mistake. It was a calculated, frantic act of pure self-preservation. He needed to sacrifice my life so he could steal my equity and avoid a concrete cell. Derek sat down heavily on the plush living room sofa and opened his silver laptop. He placed the stack of bank documents next to the computer. I leaned closer to my own screen, watching his fingers fly across his keyboard. Through the high-definition camera, hidden in the smoke detector above him, I could see the exact reflection of the commercial lending portal glowing on his monitor. He was logging into the secure banking network. He was initiating a massive multi-state financial transaction based entirely on a mountain of fraudulent lies. "Here we go," Derek muttered, keeping his eyes locked on his screen. "The final authorization protocols. I just have to digitally sign the promissory note and pledge the property as the primary collateral." Bill let out a low, angry breath beside me. "He is really going to do it, Hank." Bill whispered, his voice thick with disbelief and rising fury. "He is going to sign away your entire house." I did not take my eyes off the monitor. "He thinks he is signing away my house," I corrected him. My voice completely devoid of warmth. I kept my tone flat and mechanical. What he is actually doing is signing his own permanent confession. Derek clicked the digital pen tool on his laptop. I watched him scroll through the dense legal jargon of the commercial lending contract. He did not read the terms. He did not care about the interest rates or the predatory repayment clauses. He only cared about saving his own skin and securing the cash. He reached the bottom of the final page. There was a bold black line requiring his sworn legal signature. Underneath that line was a strict federal warning stating that any false information provided in the document constituted severe bank fraud, punishable by decades in a federal penitentiary. Derek did not even hesitate. He confidently typed his name into the authorization box and clicked the bright green button labeled Submit. In that exact fleeting microsecond, the entire legal reality of the situation fundamentally shifted. At that precise moment, a soft, high-pitched digital chime echoed through the silent hunting cabin. I looked away from the surveillance video and glanced down at my secondary, secure laptop. A bright red notification banner flashed across my encrypted email inbox. It was an automated security alert from the blind corporate limited liability company that Victor and I had established just a few days ago. The alert confirmed that an unauthorized external entity was attempting to place a $250,000 commercial lien against Apex Industrial Holdings. The trap had officially snapped shut. The heavy steel jaws of consequence had just locked permanently around my son's ankles. Derek clapped his hands together and slammed his laptop shut. "It is done," he shouted, jumping up from the sofa and grabbing his glass of bourbon. "The wire transfer is officially initiated. We are rich. We are clear. The house is completely leveraged and the money is ours." Chloe threw her head back and laughed while Preston and Cynthia eagerly raised their glasses in a twisted celebratory toast. They were drinking to my demise. They were toasting to their successful theft. They firmly believed they had executed the perfect, flawless crime. They thought they had buried a helpless old diesel mechanic in the sand and walked away with the keys to his kingdom. I sat back in the wooden chair and stared at their smiling faces on the monitor. The freezing diamond-hard anger inside my chest settled into a profound, terrifying calm. They had absolutely no idea what they had just done. Because the county property records take several weeks to update publicly, Derek still firmly believed the house was legally registered in my personal name. He believed the fraudulent conservatorship order gave him the ultimate right to pledge the property as collateral. He thought he was simply exploiting a local family loophole. But the house did not belong to Hank Caldwell anymore. The house legally belonged to a completely separate, shielded corporate entity registered in an entirely different state. When Derek clicked that final submit button, he did not just steal money from his father. He committed aggravated federal bank fraud. He transmitted a forged financial document across state wire systems. He committed blatant perjury under oath by pledging a massive corporate asset that he had absolutely zero legal right to touch. He had instantly upgraded his crime from a messy local domestic dispute into a massive multi-state federal conspiracy. The local police might have eventually believed his fake tears and his fabricated dementia story. A county judge might have given him a sympathetic slap on the wrist for a family misunderstanding. But the federal banking authorities do not care about fake tears. The federal auditors do not care about emotional excuses. They only care about the cold, hard, digital paper trail. And Derek had just handed them a perfectly documented signed confession wrapped in a bow. "He thinks the money is going to save him," I said quietly, breaking the heavy silence in the cabin. I kept my eyes fixed on Derek's celebrating face. I watched him hug his greedy wife and shake hands with his parasitic father-in-law. Bill looked at me, a fierce, satisfied glint replacing the anger in his eyes. "How long until the bank realizes the collateral is completely fake?" Bill asked, leaning back in his chair. "The automated commercial clearinghouses process these massive equity transfers in batches," I explained, outlining the strict mechanical schedule of his destruction. "They release the preliminary funds immediately to satisfy the client, but their back-end risk management algorithms will run a deep forensic sweep of the property deed by Wednesday morning. They are going to pull the actual legal title. They are going to see that the house is owned by Apex Industrial Holdings. They are going to see that Derek has absolutely zero authorization to leverage a corporate asset." "And then what happens?" Bill asked, a dark smile forming on his face. "And then the entire system automatically violently locks down," I replied, my voice completely steady. "The bank will instantly freeze the $250,000, but they will not stop there. They will freeze every single personal account attached to Derek's name. They will freeze Chloe's credit cards. They will freeze Preston and Cynthia's accounts for being listed as secondary beneficiaries on the routing numbers. The bank will immediately flag the transaction as a high-level money laundering attempt, and they will dispatch the information directly to the federal authorities." I looked back at the surveillance monitor. Derek was standing by the fireplace, proudly explaining his grand renovation plans to Cynthia. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his entire life was about to be mathematically permanently dismantled. He had abandoned me in the desert to avoid a state embezzlement charge. Now, he was going to face the crushing, inescapable weight of the federal government. I reached forward and closed the laptop screen. I did not need to watch them celebrate anymore. The emotional pain of the betrayal was entirely gone. I was no longer a grieving father, mourning the loss of his only son. I was a master mechanic watching a catastrophically defective engine finally tear itself to shreds. The financial ambush was completely set. The wire fraud was sealed in permanent digital ink. My son had tied a thick, heavy rope around his own neck, and I was perfectly content to sit in the quiet shadows of the mountain cabin and let him hang himself. The absolute reckoning was no longer a possibility. It was a guaranteed mathematical certainty, and when the dust finally settled, there would be absolutely nothing left of the arrogant boy who thought he could throw me away. The heavy mountain fog was still clinging stubbornly to the towering pine trees when the first rays of the morning sun pierced through the dusty windows of the hunting cabin. I sat completely alone at the rough-hewn dining table. My calloused hands were wrapped tightly around a thick ceramic mug filled with bitter black coffee. The rugged laptop screen glowed brightly in the dim freezing room, illuminating my weathered face. I had been awake since 3 a.m, sitting perfectly still and listening to the rhythmic crackle of the wood stove. I was waiting patiently for the digital tripwire to finally snap. My ruthless estate attorney, Victor, had promised me that the commercial banking algorithms operated with the cold, calculating efficiency of a perfectly tuned machine. He was absolutely right. At exactly 15 minutes past 9, my encrypted cellular phone began to vibrate violently against the wooden table. It was Victor calling directly from his secure downtown legal office. I answered the call and pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the crisp, professional satisfaction dripping from his voice. He told me the trap had officially sprung. The back-end risk management division at the massive commercial bank had initiated their mandatory deep dive verification process for the $250,000 home equity line of credit. They had bypassed the slow, outdated county public records and pulled the actual updated legal title to verify the collateral. Instead of seeing the name of a helpless elderly man suffering from severe dementia, they found a blind corporate limited liability company named Apex Industrial Holdings. The massive financial institution instantly realized that the property deed was entirely void. They saw clearly that Derek had committed blatant federal perjury on his sworn commercial loan application. Victor explained the cascading sequence of events to me with the precision of a master architect watching a beautifully controlled demolition. The moment the automated anti-money laundering algorithms detected the massive multi-state fraud, they did not pause to ask questions. A banking computer does not feel human sympathy or care about a fabricated family tragedy. It only processes cold, hard mathematical code. The system initiated a catastrophic and irreversible financial lockdown. The bank instantly froze the $250,000 equity transfer, preventing a single solitary cent from reaching Derek's corporate escrow account. They systematically traced every single routing number and social security number associated with the fraudulent application. Within a matter of seconds, the commercial bank froze Derek's personal checking and savings accounts. They froze his entire retirement portfolio. They flagged Chloe's designer credit cards and suspended her spending limits entirely. Because Derek had foolishly listed Preston and Cynthia as secondary beneficiaries to appease their ravenous greed, the algorithms mercilessly locked down their accounts as well. Every single financial artery keeping those 4 parasites alive was completely severed in the blink of an eye. They were instantly cut off from the modern world with absolutely zero warning. Victor told me to sit back and watch the surveillance cameras because the shockwaves were about to hit the surface with devastating force. I did not have hidden cameras inside the luxury downtown boutique, of course, but I did not need them. The surveillance microphones inside my house captured the frantic, panicked phone calls and the explosive aftermath, perfectly painting a vivid, detailed picture of Chloe's ultimate public humiliation. Earlier that morning, Chloe had left my house dressed in her most extravagant designer clothes. She had scheduled a lavish shopping spree with 3 of her wealthy elitist friends from the country club. She strutted out the front door firmly believing she was now $250,000 richer. She went to an exclusive high-end boutique downtown, a place where the elegant sales associates serve imported champagne while you browse leather handbags that cost more than a reliable used vehicle. According to the furious screaming I would hear later, Chloe had confidently gathered over $12,000 worth of designer merchandise on the glass counter. She was bragging loudly to her country club friends about her new financial freedom and her massive upcoming home renovation. She desperately wanted to prove that she was the absolute reigning queen of their shallow, materialistic social circle. She casually handed her premium gold credit card to the elegant sales associate, expecting the transaction to flow as smoothly as it always did. But the machine did not chime with polite approval. It let out a harsh, flat beep. The associate quietly informed her that the card had been declined. Chloe laughed it off, claiming it was a simple banking error or a daily security limit issue. She confidently reached into her expensive purse and produced a different platinum credit card. She swiped the magnetic strip again. Another harsh, flat beep echoed through the quiet boutique. Declined again. Chloe began to feel the cold, creeping sensation of pure embarrassment as her wealthy friends exchanged confused, judgmental glances. The illusion of her grand wealth was beginning to crack in public. She frantically pulled out a third card, a joint account tied directly to Derek's primary banking ledger. She aggressively shoved it into the card reader. Declined. The terminal flashed a stark red warning message instructing the merchant to confiscate the physical card and contact the fraud department immediately. The polite, accommodating demeanor of the sales associate vanished entirely. The store security guard, a tall, imposing man in a dark, tailored suit, stepped closer to the register. Chloe demanded that they try the cards again, her voice rising in a shrill, panicked crescendo. She yelled that she had hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank and that their machine was clearly broken and insulting. The manager of the boutique was called over to assess the escalating situation. He calmly but firmly informed Chloe that her accounts were locked by a federal banking alert for suspected fraudulent activity. He then politely asked her to leave the premises immediately. Her elitist country club friends, the very people she had stolen my late wife's hand-stitched quilts to impress, quietly stepped away from her as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. They whispered to each other, covering their mouths, as the security guard formally escorted a humiliated, sobbing Chloe out of the heavy glass doors and onto the busy downtown sidewalk. She was left standing on the cold concrete, entirely empty-handed and completely stripped of her fake, aristocratic dignity. I sat in the quiet hunting cabin, my eyes glued to the living room camera feed. The heavy oak front door of my house suddenly flew open with such violent force that it slammed hard against the drywall, leaving a visible dent. Chloe burst into the foyer. Her expensive makeup was smeared completely down her cheeks from crying. Her designer dress was wrinkled, and her chest was heaving with an erratic, animalistic panic. Derek was pacing the living room floor, desperately clicking his computer mouse and staring at his laptop screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He had just tried to wire the stolen equity funds back into his corporate escrow account to cover his embezzlement tracks before his firm initiated their morning audit. But his access was completely denied. Preston and Cynthia were sitting on my sofa holding their own smartphones, looking equally terrified and deeply confused. Chloe marched directly up to Derek and shoved him hard against his chest. "What in the world is happening, Derek?" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "Every single one of my cards just declined in front of the entire country club committee. I was treated like a common criminal and physically escorted out of the boutique by a security guard. The bank told me my accounts are frozen for severe fraud. Fix this right now, you useless coward." Derek looked at her with wide, terrified eyes. His breathing was rapid and shallow. He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of absolute, pathetic defeat. "I cannot fix it, Chloe," he stammered, his voice dropping into a shaky, desperate whisper. "They locked everything. The home equity funds did not clear. The bank pulled the entire transfer back this morning. My primary checking account is frozen. My corporate access is permanently suspended." The Federal Fraud Department just sent an automated notice to my legal email address. They know about the house. They know I do not own the property. Preston leaped up from the sofa, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. What do you mean you do not own the property? Preston roared, grabbing Derek aggressively by the collar of his white dress shirt. You told us the emergency conservatorship gave you absolute total control. You told us the equity was completely secured and untouchable. I just tried to pay my own mortgage, and the commercial bank told me my assets are frozen because my social security number is tied to an active federal money laundering investigation. You dragged us into a massive federal crime, you stupid boy. Derek aggressively shoved Preston away, stumbling backward over the glass coffee table. I did not know, Derek shouted wildly, pulling at his hair like a madman. The public county records showed the house was still in my father's personal name. But the commercial bank ran a deep forensic title search this morning. The deed does not belong to my father anymore. It was transferred out of his name days ago to a blind corporate holding company. Someone set me up. Someone completely orchestrated this entire massive trap to destroy me. Cynthia let out a loud, dramatic wail, burying her face in her manicured hands. We are going to prison, Cynthia sobbed, rocking back and forth on the couch. We are going to lose absolutely everything we have. We are ruined. The pristine, civilized facade of their upper-class family completely disintegrated right before my eyes. The absolute panic stripped away all of their polite manners, leaving nothing but selfish, desperate rats trapped in a rapidly sinking ship. Chloe let out a primal scream of pure frustration and grabbed the expensive crystal vase sitting on the mantel. She hurled it across the room where it smashed violently against the brick fireplace, sending sharp shards of glass flying everywhere. If the bank froze everything, we have absolutely no money, Chloe screamed, pacing the room like a caged lunatic. I need cash, Derek. I need cash right now to hire a premium criminal defense attorney before the federal agents knock on this front door. Where did your father keep his cash? The three of them completely lost their minds. I watched in cold, silent satisfaction as they turned into ravenous wild dogs. They began to aggressively tear my living room apart. Derek threw the couch cushions onto the floor, blindly reaching his shaking hands deep into the crevices. Preston pulled the heavy oak drawers out of my antique desk, dumping my files all over the hardwood floor. Chloe ran into the kitchen, and I switched the camera feed to follow her destructive path. She began violently yanking the cabinet doors open, sweeping my ceramic plates onto the tile floor where they shattered into pieces. She was frantically searching for a hidden safe or anything she could pawn for quick legal fees. She screamed vicious curses at Derek, blaming him entirely for her miserable, doomed existence. Derek shouted back from the living room, blaming her insatiable, boundless greed for forcing him to embezzle the corporate funds in the first place. I leaned back in the creaking wooden chair, sipping my cold coffee. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace wash over my tired soul. They were systematically destroying their own marriage in less than 10 minutes. The crushing pressure of the federal financial lockdown had completely broken them. They were tearing the house apart, looking for a physical salvation that simply did not exist. I had made absolutely sure to remove every single dollar and every piece of valuable jewelry from that property months ago. They were desperately searching an empty tomb. Watching them rip the house apart did not hurt me. A house can be easily rebuilt. But seeing the absolute terror in my son's eyes, seeing him realize that his cowardly actions had finally caught up to him was the exact justice I had been waiting for. He had thrown me into the desert expecting me to die silently so he could live like a king. Now he was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The federal noose was tightening around his neck with every passing second, and there was absolutely no one coming to save him. I would sit back and enjoy every moment of his monumental collapse. The heavy mountain fog was still clinging stubbornly to the towering pine trees when the first rays of the morning sun pierced through the dusty windows of the hunting cabin. I sat completely alone at the rough-hewn dining table. My calloused hands were wrapped tightly around a thick ceramic mug filled with bitter black coffee. The rugged laptop screen glowed brightly in the dim, freezing room, illuminating my weathered face. I had been awake since 3 in the morning, sitting perfectly still and listening to the rhythmic crackle of the wood stove. I was waiting patiently for the digital tripwire to finally snap. My ruthless estate attorney, Victor, had promised me that the commercial banking algorithms operated with the cold, calculating efficiency of a perfectly tuned machine. He was absolutely right. As I stood up, walked to the small mirror, and stared at my own reflection. I was not the same broken, exhausted man who had stumbled out of the Mojave Desert 2 weeks ago. My skin was still deeply tanned and weathered from the blistering sun, but my posture was completely rigid and unyielding. I took a deep breath and buttoned up the crisp white shirt I had brought with me. Over it, I put on a dark, navy-tailored suit. Martha had bought me this suit 5 years ago for an anniversary dinner. She always said a hard-working man deserved to look like a king every once in a while. I smoothed the lapels with my calloused hands. Today, I was not just a grieving father or a retired heavy-duty mechanic. Today, I was the absolute instrument of consequence. I walked out to the dirt yard where Bill was waiting by his battered pickup truck. He looked at me and offered a slow, approving nod. We drove down the winding mountain roads in complete silence. The thick timberland fog slowly gave way to the bright, glaring sunlight of the city limits. We headed straight for the Central County Courthouse. It was a massive, imposing structure built from heavy gray stone and marble. It was a place designed to dispense cold, impartial justice. That was exactly what I had come to collect. When we pulled into the parking lot, my attorney Victor Sterling was already waiting near the grand entrance. He looked immaculate in his expensive charcoal suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase that held the absolute destruction of my son. Standing right beside Victor was Sheriff Tom Miller, wearing his crisp tan uniform and a polished silver badge. Flanking them were 2 serious, stone-faced men wearing dark, conservative suits and discreet earpieces. They were federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Victor had handed them the entire digital paper trail of Derek pledging a corporate asset across state wire systems. The federal government does not take kindly to massive commercial bank fraud. They had come to collect their pound of flesh. We walked up the wide, concrete steps of the courthouse together. My heart was beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. We navigated through the metal detectors and walked down the long, echoing marble hallway toward courtroom number 4. This was the specific chamber where the probate judge handled emergency conservatorships and estate disputes. The heavy oak doors to the courtroom were closed, but I could hear the muffled sounds of the proceedings happening inside. Victor held up a hand, signaling for us to stop just outside the doors. We stood in the quiet hallway, listening closely. The acoustics of the old building allowed the voices from inside to bleed through the thick wood. I recognized the voice speaking immediately. It was Derek. My son was standing in front of a county judge, putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. His voice was trembling with a perfectly manufactured sorrow. He sounded like a devastated, heartbroken child who had lost his hero. "Your Honor," Derek said, his voice cracking with fake emotion, "I cannot even begin to describe the absolute nightmare these past few weeks have been. My father was a good, hard-working man. He spent his entire life providing for our family. But his mind was failing him so rapidly. The dementia was aggressive and terrifying. He would wake up and not even know where he was. He would look at me and not even recognize his own son." I felt my hands curl into tight, heavy fists at my sides. He was weaponizing my age and stealing my dignity to cover up a felony. He was painting me as a pathetic, confused burden. On the day he disappeared, Derek continued letting out a loud, ragged sniffle. We were just taking a quiet drive to look at some property. I stopped at a rest area just for a moment. When I came back to the car, the passenger door was wide open and he was gone. I searched everywhere. I screamed his name until my lungs burned. The desert is so vast and unforgiving. The search and rescue teams told me that someone in his fragile mental state would not survive more than a few hours in that brutal heat. They told me I have to accept that he is gone. I heard the gentle, sympathetic voice of the judge responding. The judge offered his deepest condolences for the tragic, terrible loss. The judge stated that losing a parent to the wilderness was an unimaginable burden for a young man to carry. Your Honor, my lawyer is submitting the final petition for the permanent conservatorship, Derek said, sounding utterly exhausted by his fake grief. My father has an estate, a home, and financial accounts that are currently sitting in limbo. Without this permanent order, I cannot maintain the property or settle his outstanding affairs. I just want to honor his legacy and make sure his hard-earned assets are protected and managed properly. It is the absolute least I can do for him now. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his lies echoed in the hallway. He was begging the judge to hand him the keys to my kingdom so he could drain my life savings and save himself from a federal embezzlement charge. He was asking for legal permission to rob a corpse he created. The judge let out a heavy sigh. The court has reviewed the initial emergency filings and the search and rescue reports, the judge stated officially. Given the tragic circumstances and the presumed passing of Mr. Caldwell, I am prepared to grant the motion for permanent conservatorship. However, for the official record, I must ask if there are any objections to this motion before I sign the final binding order. Victor looked at me and nodded. Sheriff Tom adjusted his belt. The two federal agents stepped back slightly, giving me the center position. It was time. I reached forward and pushed the heavy oak doors open with both of my hands. They swung wide with a loud, resounding thud that echoed like a cannon blast through the quiet, solemn courtroom. Every single head in the room snapped toward the back aisle. The court reporter stopped typing. The bailiff stood up straight. The judge peered over his reading glasses with a look of profound confusion. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. My leather dress shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. I did not rush. I set a slow, terrifyingly calm pace. I looked stronger and healthier than I had in years. The tailored navy suit fit my broad shoulders perfectly. I was flanked on my left by my ruthless corporate attorney Victor, and on my right by Sheriff Tom Miller. The two federal agents followed closely behind, sealing the exit. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the plaintiff table at the front of the room. Derek was standing there, holding a tissue in his hand. Chloe was sitting right behind him in the gallery, wearing a dark morning dress and dabbing her dry eyes. When Derek turned around and saw me walking toward him, the blood completely and instantly drained from his face. His jaw literally dropped open. The fake tissue slipped from his trembling fingers and fluttered silently to the wooden floor. His eyes bulged with pure, unadulterated, soul-crushing terror. He looked exactly like a man staring directly at a resurrected ghost, because in his greedy, calculating mind, that is exactly what I was. Chloe let out a sharp, gasping shriek and slapped both of her hands over her mouth. She scrambled backward in the wooden pew, her eyes wide with total panic. She recognized instantly that the flawless crime they thought they had committed was entirely unraveling before her eyes. I reached the low wooden swinging gate that separated the gallery from the legal tables. I pushed it open and stepped directly into the well of the court. I stopped just a few feet away from my son. He was shaking so violently that I could actually hear his teeth clicking together. "Dad." Derek whispered, his voice barely a terrified squeak. "Dad, you are alive." I did not look at him. I completely ignored his existence. I turned my body and faced the bench, directly looking up at the stunned magistrate. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice in anger. Yelling is for people who have lost control of a situation. I had absolute, total control. I spoke with cold, terrifying, mechanical precision. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying clearly and steadily across the silent room. My name is Hank Caldwell. I am not deceased. I am not wandering lost in the Mojave Desert. And as you can clearly see, I am most certainly not suffering from severe, rapid-onset dementia. My mind is perfectly sound. The judge stared at me in total disbelief. Mr. Caldwell, the judge stammered, looking down at the thick file of fraudulent medical records and police reports on his desk. We were informed that you wandered away from a vehicle during a severe medical episode. There was a massive statewide search. I was not lost, Your Honor, I replied, my tone freezing the very air in the room. I was intentionally abandoned. I was shoved out of a moving luxury sports utility vehicle onto a blistering asphalt highway in a 113-degree desert. I was left there to die of exposure and dehydration by the very man standing in front of you. My own son. A collective gasp ripped through the courtroom. The bailiff placed his hand on his sidearm. Derek stumbled backward, bumping into the heavy wooden table. His sleazy defense attorney looked at him with Wenker's frantic eyes, suddenly realizing he had been dragged into a massive criminal conspiracy. "That is a lie," Derek screamed, his voice cracking with hysterical panic. He is confused. He does not know what he is talking about. He is having a delusion. The heat must have damaged his brain. I love my father. I would never do something like that to him. You have to believe me. I slowly reached into the interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a small silver flash drive. I held it up so the judge, the lawyers, and my terrified son could see it clearly. There are no delusions here, Derek, I said, turning my head to finally look him directly in the eyes. Just cold, hard, undeniable facts. Your Honor, this flash drive contains the internal dash cam footage from my son's leased luxury sports utility vehicle. It was automatically uploaded to his cloud insurance backup, which my attorney easily subpoenaed with a federal warrant. Derek stopped breathing entirely. His face turned a sickly pale shade of green. He had completely forgotten about the modern surveillance technology built directly into his own expensive vehicle. The video captures the entire drive into the desert, I explained smoothly, addressing the judge. It captures the violent argument over an $84,000 debt. It captures my son demanding that I sign over the deed to my house so he could pay off the money he embezzled from his corporate employer. And it perfectly clearly captures the exact moment he physically assaulted me, threw a half-empty water bottle at my chest, and sped away, leaving an old man to die in the dirt. I stepped forward and placed the silver flash drive gently onto the edge of the judge's elevated wooden bench. The judge looked at the small device as if it were a loaded weapon. But the attempted murder is only a small fraction of why we are here today, I continued, turning my attention back to the entire courtroom. My son filed a false police report. He lied to this court to secure an emergency conservatorship. He wanted you to grant him control of my house so he could secure a $250,000 home equity line of credit. He needed that money desperately to replace the stolen corporate funds before his firm initiated a massive forensic audit this morning. Derek fell back into his wooden chair, covering his face with his trembling hands. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air as the crushing weight of his catastrophic failure finally broke his spirit. The arrogant facade was completely pulverized. He was nothing more than a pathetic, exposed criminal. Unfortunately for him, I said, stepping back and gesturing toward my attorney, Victor had already legally transferred the deed of my house out of my personal name and into a blind, corporate, limited liability company days ago. When my son walked into that commercial bank last week and signed those lending documents under penalty of perjury, he pledged a corporate asset he had absolutely zero legal right to touch. He committed multi-state wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. At that exact moment, the two federal agents stepped forward from the back of the room. They walked with brisk, purposeful strides directly past the wooden gate and approached the defense table. The local sheriff, Tom Miller, walked right beside them, a look of grim satisfaction on his weathered face. Derek Thorne Caldwell. One of the federal agents announced, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority, "You are under arrest for multi-state federal wire fraud, aggravated bank fraud, felony embezzlement, and perjury. Sheriff Miller here will also be charging you locally with attempted murder and elder abuse." Derek did not fight back. He did not scream or protest. The absolute total destruction of his life had drained every single ounce of energy from his body. He simply stood up, his legs wobbling dangerously, and allowed the federal agent to pull his arms behind his back. The loud, sharp, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the silent courtroom. It was the beautiful mechanical sound of absolute justice. Chloe jumped up from her seat in the gallery, her face twisted into a mask of pure, selfish panic. "Derek!" she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "Tell them I had nothing to do with this. Tell them I did not know about the embezzlement. You cannot let them take the house." "Where am I supposed to go?" The second federal agent turned and looked directly at Chloe, pulling another pair of steel handcuffs from his dark suit. "Chloe Thorne," the agent said, stepping toward her, "you are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit bank fraud and possession of stolen funds. The commercial bank flagged your credit accounts trying to access the fraudulent equity line this morning." Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical shriek as the agent grabbed her wrists and secured the cuffs. She thrashed and cried, begging anyone in the room to listen to her screaming that she was a victim, that her husband was a monster, that she deserved better. No one listened. The court reporters and the bailiffs simply watched the pathetic display of a greedy parasite finally getting what she deserved. I stood in the center of the courtroom, completely motionless, as the federal agents escorted my weeping, broken son and his hysterical wife down the center aisle. Derek walked with his head bowed, entirely unable to meet the eyes of the people in the gallery. As he passed by me, he stopped for a brief fraction of a second. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes, tears streaming freely down his pale face. "Dad," he whispered, a pathetic begging sound, "please. I am sorry." I looked at him, the boy I had raised, the boy I had loved, the boy who had tried to discard me in the desert like a piece of useless garbage. I felt absolutely nothing. The fatherly compassion was permanently dead. "You made your choice in the desert, Derek," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as a steel anvil. "Now you get to live with the consequences. Enjoy the concrete." I turned my back on him, completely facing the front of the room, as the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open and the federal agents marched them out into the hallway. The loud, heavy thud of the doors closing behind them sounded like a massive vault sealing shut forever. The judge looked down at me from the bench, a look of deep, profound respect etched into his features. The judge picked up his wooden gavel and struck the sound block once. "The motion for conservatorship is officially denied, with extreme prejudice," the judge declared loudly. "And let the record reflect that Mr. Hank Caldwell is very much alive." I nodded my head once to the judge, a simple gesture of gratitude and respect. I turned and walked back down the aisle alongside my lawyer and Sheriff Tom. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors and walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, warm sunlight of the city. I took a deep, clean breath of fresh air, filling my lungs with the sweet, intoxicating scent of absolute freedom. The heavy, burdensome weight I had been carrying for weeks was finally lifted from my shoulders. I had survived the desert. I had survived the betrayal. And I had meticulously, flawlessly executed the total destruction of the people who tried to ruin me. I was a master mechanic, and I had successfully dismantled the most toxic, defective machine in my life. I was going back to my quiet house in the suburbs. I was going to sit on my porch, drink a cup of black coffee, and enjoy the rest of my days in absolute, uninterrupted peace. The righteous fury of a betrayed father had been satisfied, and justice cold and undeniable had finally been served. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind them, but the legal storm was just beginning to rage with an absolute devastating fury. The federal agents had Derek in custody, but Chloe immediately went into a state of absolute frantic survival mode. During the preliminary legal hearings, she hired her own highly expensive defense attorney and desperately tried to play the role of the innocent, heavily manipulated wife. She stood before the federal magistrate, dressed in modest conservative clothing with fake tears streaming down her perfectly powdered cheeks. She swore under penalty of federal perjury that she had absolutely no idea Derek was embezzling massive corporate funds from his employer. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my son and claimed he was a deeply controlling, abusive monster who forced her to participate in the fraudulent home equity scheme against her will. Her parents, Preston and Cynthia, eagerly backed up every single deceptive lie she told the court. They testified under oath that they were just visiting our home to offer emotional support during a tragic, confusing time. They claimed they were completely horrified by Derek and his severe criminal actions, and that they were simply innocent bystanders caught in the chaotic crossfire of his massive financial conspiracy. It was a masterful, highly choreographed theatrical performance, specifically designed to throw my son entirely under the heavy, crushing wheels of justice while they walked away completely free and clear to ruin someone else. But they forgot one crucial, terrifying detail in their arrogant, selfish panic. They completely forgot about the covert, encrypted, high-definition security cameras I had meticulously installed in every corner of my own home months ago. My ruthless estate attorney, Victor, had already handed the entire encrypted surveillance hard drive over to the lead federal prosecutor long before the trial began. When Chloe took the witness stand to deliver her final weeping, dramatic plea for mercy, the prosecutor did not even bother cross-examining her fabricated, ridiculous story. He simply turned on the courtroom audio-visual system and played the exact digital recording captured directly from my home office. The crystal-clear, high-definition audio of Chloe screaming at Derek echoed powerfully off the high marble ceilings of the silent federal courthouse. Every single person in the crowded gallery heard her viciously demanding stolen cash to pay for her extravagant luxury lifestyle. They heard her explicitly acknowledge that Derek had intentionally abandoned me in the lethal, blistering heat of the Mojave Desert just to steal the deed to my suburban house. They heard her completely dismiss my supposed painful, agonizing death as a necessary, simple business transaction to cover her disastrous cryptocurrency losses and successfully fund her obsessive luxury shopping addiction. The fake innocent tears on Chloe and her parents' faces instantly evaporated into thin air. The healthy, vibrant color completely drained from their skin as they realized they had just committed aggravated federal perjury in front of a furious, unforgiving federal judge. The prosecutor then played the crystal-clear surveillance video of Chloe viciously shoving my late wife Martha and her beautiful hand-stitched church bazaar quilts into a black plastic garbage bag, calling them cheap, dirty blue-collar garbage. The entire jury physically recoiled in absolute, unadulterated disgust and horror. The fragile, carefully constructed illusion of the innocent victim was completely pulverized into fine dust right before their very eyes, leaving nothing but the ugly, undeniable truth. The final sentencing hearing arrived 3 agonizing months later, and the massive federal courtroom was packed to absolute full capacity, with local journalists and former elite country club friends eager to watch the spectacle. The federal judge, a stern, unyielding woman with decades of unforgiving legal experience, looked down at my son and his treacherous in-laws with a gaze of pure, absolute judicial contempt. She stated clearly for the official court record that in her entire, long judicial career, she had never witnessed such a cold-blooded, sociopathic display of immense human greed and calculating elder abuse. She did not show them a single ounce of judicial mercy or standard compassion. The judge struck her heavy wooden gavel against the sound block with a deafening crack and sentenced Derek to 20 full consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for attempted murder, multi-state wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He was going to spend the absolute best remaining years of his adult life locked inside a tiny freezing concrete box, completely surrounded by steel bars and razor wire. Because the digital audio recordings completely destroyed their fraudulent victim defense, Chloe and her parents were formally charged and convicted as willing and eager accomplices to a massive federal financial conspiracy. Chloe received 15 long, miserable years behind bars without the absolute possibility of early parole or good behavior reductions. Preston and Cynthia, the arrogant, wealthy socialites who thought my blue-collar home was far too tacky for their refined, elegant tastes, were sentenced to 10 agonizing years each for actively participating in the fraudulent home equity transfer. They would legally lose their prestigious country club memberships, their imported luxury cars, their expensive designer wardrobes, and every single stolen penny they had left hidden in their offshore bank accounts. Their elite high society status was permanently and irrevocably erased from the world forever. As the heavily armed federal marshals moved in to place the heavy, thick steel shackles on their wrists, Derek suddenly broke away from his defense lawyer. He turned his body toward the crowded gallery and looked directly at me, sitting quietly in the front row. His arrogant swagger and unearned toxic confidence were completely gone forever, never to return. He was nothing but a broken, terrified, sniveling coward facing 2 long decades of absolute total misery and isolation. "Dad," he begged, his voice cracking into a loud, pathetic, echoing sob that filled the room. "Dad, please say something to the judge right now. Please help me get out of this terrible nightmare. I am your son. I am your own flesh and blood. You cannot let them take me away to a federal prison." I slowly stood up from the hard wooden bench and carefully buttoned the jacket of my tailored navy suit. I looked at the grown man I had spent 40 long, exhausting years sacrificing my physical body, my sleep, and my peace of mind to protect from the harsh realities of the world. I looked at the spoiled boy who had violently thrown a warm plastic water bottle at my chest and left me to bake to death in the scorching, unforgiving Mojave sand over a simple financial debt. "Blood does not make you a son," I said, my voice carrying clearly and steadily across the entirely silent, shocked courtroom. "Blood just makes you a biological relative connected by pure random chance. Loyalty, respect, and basic human decency are what actually make you family in this life. You happily burned our entire family legacy to the ground just to buy a few expensive designer handbags and secure a false temporary social status among shallow people. Now you get to sit entirely alone in the cold, dark ashes for the next 20 years. I turned my back to him completely and slowly walked down the long, wide center aisle of the courthouse. I did not look over my shoulder even a single time as his frantic, desperate screaming was completely swallowed by the heavy thudding sound of the massive courtroom doors closing permanently behind me, sealing his fate forever. The exact moment the federal trial concluded and absolute justice was officially served, I called a local real estate agent and listed my large suburban house on the open market. The property sold in less than a single week to a nice young hard-working family, paying entirely in liquid cash. I knew deep in my heart that I could never sleep peacefully in that house ever again, no matter how much time passed. The walls were completely stained by the toxic, suffocating memory of their unhinged greed and the sickening, profound disrespect they had openly showed to my beautiful late wife, Martha, and everything we had built together. I took the massive payout money from the real estate sale, combined it with my hard-earned mechanic pension and my newly recovered life savings, and drove far away from the noisy, polluted, sprawling city. I bought a small, peaceful, beautiful wooden cabin sitting right on the edge of a crystal-clear timberland lake, surrounded by towering green pine trees and absolute pristine wilderness silence. I spend my early morning sitting quietly on the back wooden deck, drinking hot, bitter black coffee, and watching the thick white morning mist roll gently off the calm, undisturbed water. But I am not just resting idly in my quiet, well-deserved retirement. I took a very significant portion of my recovered accumulated wealth and officially established a powerful, aggressive legal foundation called the Martha Caldwell Elder Defense Fund. I hired Victor and an elite, dedicated team of the most ruthless, aggressive corporate litigators and private investigators in the entire state. We dedicated the entire foundation and all of our extensive legal resources to hunting down entitled, treacherous children who try to financially abuse, isolate, or manipulate their aging, vulnerable parents for personal financial gain. We provide completely free, highly aggressive legal representation to elderly victims who have been silenced, robbed, or cruelly discarded by the very people they raised and blindly trusted. Every single time our elite legal team freezes a fraudulent bank account or sends an abusive, entitled relative to a cold, concrete jail cell, I know deep in my soul that I am properly honoring Martha and her enduring, beautiful legacy of kindness, strength, and unwavering protection. As I sit here today, watching the bright, golden sunset reflect beautifully off the calm, serene lake water, I realize that the absolute greatest, most profound lesson I learned out there in the burning, lethal heat of the desert was about the dangerous, deceptive illusion of family blood. We are constantly taught from a very young age by polite society that we must unconditionally love and automatically forgive the people who happen to share our last name, regardless of their actions. We are deeply socially conditioned to endure endless disrespect, psychological manipulation, and financial theft, simply because the abuse supposedly comes from our own flesh and blood. But I am here to tell you right now, that is a toxic, lethal lie designed entirely to keep good, honest people trapped in terrible, soul-crushing situations. Family is absolutely not a free pass to abuse you or endlessly take advantage of your generosity and kindness. Sharing biological DNA does not magically give someone the legal or moral right to drain your hard-earned bank accounts, disrespect your lifetime of honest hard work, or treat you like a disposable, inconvenient burden when you finally grow old and need support. True respect must be actively earned through positive actions every single day, and your personal boundaries must always remain absolute firm and completely impenetrable, no matter who is standing on the other side of the line. I had to face the truly terrifying, heartbreaking reality that the young, innocent boy I raised and loved had slowly become a cold, calculating, unfeeling monster. I permanently lost a son to his own unquenchable, bottomless greed, but by surviving the lethal desert heat and fighting back with pure, cold, mechanical logic, I successfully reclaimed my own soul and my ultimate freedom. I took back my stolen dignity, and I turned my absolute greatest emotional pain into a powerful protective shield for others who simply cannot fight for themselves against the greedy people they mistakenly love. If you have ever had to draw an incredibly hard, firm line with toxic family members who intentionally mistook your kindness and patience for absolute weakness, I want you to let me know your story in the comments section below. Drop your current city and the exact time you are watching this video so I can see exactly where my message of strength and survival is reaching you today. Please hit that like button right now to show your support for this journey, and subscribe to the channel to stand firmly with those who protect their peace and absolutely refuse to be victimized by greedy relatives. Share this specific story with anyone who might desperately need the courage to cut toxic, dangerous people out of their lives, no matter who they are or what last name they share. Remember that your peace of mind is your absolute most valuable asset in this entire world, and you must defend it at all costs against anyone who tries to take it from you. Until next time, stay incredibly strong, always trust your gut instincts, and never let anyone ever count you out.